Welcome to Human Trafficking, Trauma, and the Impact on School Communities. My name is Mordecai Dixon. I work for the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center at the South Southwest region. That's Region 6. And we are a federally funded, a SAMHSA funded program that brings these learning opportunities to you today. And so we're really encouraged. This has been one of the ones that I personally have been very interested in and waiting for some time. So we're very encouraged for this program today. The folks that are going to be presenting to you are top R. We're hoping that this is very value added for all of your practice and your scope. Before we get going, I told you a little bit about who we are. We are housed out of the Steve Hicks School of Social Work in Austin, Texas. We are a SAMHSA funded program, and I guess the biggest disclaimer is that the opinions and the views and the viewpoints that you'll hear today do not represent those or the official positions of the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. In like fashion, the views and opinions expressed during this presentation don't reflect those of the Steve Hicks School of Social Work or the University of Texas. No mention of any trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply any kind of endorsement by the school or the university. Real quickly, we're a nationwide network. So although we are in Region 6, we serve 5 state region. That includes Texas, but it also includes Oklahoma, New Mexico, Louisiana, and Arkansas. And so you can find resources, and if you haven't tapped into the MHTTC network in the past, or you don't know anything about those services, feel free to reach out to both our website and those in your states. We're going to set a culture, and that culture is pervasive. We're very serious about our values around this. And so we want to make sure that you understand right out the gate how we do programming. We don't just bring programming, we live these values. And so the MHTTC network, it's going to be using affirming language, respectful language, recovery-oriented language. And we want to stay hopeful and strength-based. We want to make sure that we're inclusive and accepting of diverse perspectives, diverse ideas, diverse ideologies. Healing centered. You're going to hear us talk a lot in these next few sessions about being healing centered and trauma responsive, not just trauma informed. Inviting individuals to participate in our journeys and sharing those journeys. And so we're going to get an opportunity to do that today. And then being mindful of person first language, please. Language that's free of labels, and looking at individuals for who they are. No assumptions, no values. Let's just, in essence, be kind. We're going to have respectful, clear, and understandable language as a result of that. And then, as I said before, we want to live those values. We want to be consistent in our policies, our actions. We really hope what you experience in the next few sessions builds on existing practice. From our vantage point, we have made this presentation secure as we possibly can, given our existing technologies. Austin, Texas, as is much of the nation, is going to have some form of solar eclipse later in the day. We don't anticipate that's going to have any impact on the technology, on our ability to do so. But if for some reason we are disconnected today, we will contact you through the registration links that you submitted to come into the program today. So don't worry about that. You are unmuted. You are muted and you are unable to unmute or share video today. If you have any comments, you've already started out with that and doing a great job of that. Use the chat. Again, living by our values and our norms. If you are taking this course today for any continuing education, we will process that. If you see right now, there are close to 300 people in this room. That means we will need time to process that on the back end of this. We'll make sure that you're emailed directly about 2 weeks or so after the session is complete. That'll give us time to do administrative pieces and make sure all of our ducks are in a row. You, however, have a job in making sure that all of the information that you told us is clear with your licensing group to make sure that you get credit for those CEUs. This session is being recorded today. This is also an opportunity based on the content to take some time, really spend some time with our own self-care, the self-care of others, maybe our colleagues, anybody who may be having some distress as a result of the content or just having distress, period. Feel free to put any kind of resources that you need in place in the comment section if you know of something that works really well or has worked for you as well. MHTTC staff that you see today are at your service. We're here, we're going to provide guidance in the background. So if you have administrative protocol questions, how are we going to do breaks, or how are we going to do, CEU questions, or will I get a copy of this session? Answer is yes. We will make all of that information, post there, all of it on our sites, and make it available to you on the back end. But if you have a content related question, we're going to ask you to put that in the Q&A section of your Zoom. Again, any special needs, feel free to use the hotline information. We're going to see this. You're going to see this more than once today. So if you don't have that information right away, it is fine. We will make sure that each of these links is provided to you. If you're new to Zoom or having a hard time with Zoom, you should see two buttons at the bottom of your screens. One is a Q&A and one is a closed caption. If you need either of those boxes, feel free to use them. And now on to the program. Ultra excited to introduce to you today Dr. Heather Curry, Dr. Marianne Thomas. Dr. Curry and I are known. I've known of her work out of the Florida area, the Tampa, Florida area specifically. She's got incredible amounts of experiences, decades of experience, practice, and professional commitments to look at systems of care for victims of human trafficking. She's been the director of Hillsborough County, Florida's County Commission on Human Trafficking, has helped and has provided cross-collaboration and system-wide work. She has been and was the chief liaison for the juvenile justice and equity work. She has a doctorate in communications theory from the University of South Florida. Her work comes out of a lens of equity, a very powerful lens of equity, working on social policy issues, homelessness, and community responsiveness to matters of equity and vulnerability. Dr. Marianne Thomas is a mental health counselor, a PhD in behavioral psychology. She has devoted her educational and devoted her time to creating human trafficking programs. She identifies the true problem of human trafficking in the United States by educating, and is a huge education in our communities on human trafficking. She also helps organizations, specifically helps them create and grow and begin to initiate their own anti-trafficking programs. She's worked with women and children experiencing homelessness, and with men and women in the incarceration systems, homeless systems. She recognized that there was a common thread of women who would trade their bodies for their and their children basic needs, and that work would propel her into a world of anti-trafficking advocacy, powerful work, building programs, monitoring and directing safe homes for minor children, girls specifically, and has an organization, My Name, My Voice. Dr. Thomas will always continue to provide support to not just her programs, but to other organizations, helping them get their anti-trafficking programs online. It is my sincere pleasure to introduce, but also to welcome you both to this program. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Mordecai. It truly is an honor to be here. And it's an honor to work alongside of Dr. Thomas and our colleagues at UT Austin. So Marianne, I wanted to offer you the opportunity, though, to complete that and complement that introduction. I think you summed me pretty well, so I'm happy with your introduction.
I was going to say, I thought Mordecai did a pretty good job on me too. My name is Marianne Thomas. And like you said, that's been my path, is through addictions and homelessness and anti-trafficking. I walked my own way through that path with lived experience, and then jumped into education to get myself out of that world. And now that's what I do, is bring my knowledge of the lived experience and the education piece back to people so that they can understand those worlds better.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think for Mordecai, one of the things that you pointed to is that equity is my primary lens. It's one of the reasons that Dr. Thomas and I connected so quickly, was understanding and reimagining the problem of human trafficking as one that is centered directly in community vulnerabilities. So we're going to talk about vulnerability in a couple of different ways today. One is the power of vulnerability and the ability to access empathy through that, but also to talk about the kind of vulnerabilities that create the situation of human trafficking. So we can move on to the next slide. So really quick, just setting the stage, I'll go over a quick agenda review. This is like an agenda for the agenda review, which is kind of meta, I guess. So we're going to do a little bit of getting to know each other. Given the webinar format, it's going to be a little bit more asking you to reflect on some questions. I like to do what I call motivated icebreakers. So they're not just, the fun icebreaker, 2 truths and a lie, but rather here are some questions that I think can help us guide the conversation moving forward. We determined that we'd like it to be as conversational as possible. So we'll be, thanks to my colleagues at UT Austin, we'll be monitoring the chat for questions as they come up. We've also built in some pauses during the course of the presentation. So a note about vulnerability, we'll go through that. We've attempted to do a short video from Brene Brown. I think that her work on vulnerability is really powerful. And I think it really sets the context and the conversation that we're going to have today. I think it's such critical work when you're talking about something that is a true tender spot in communities writ large. So, and then I'm going to hand over the mic to Dr. Thomas, who has prepared an excellent presentation to give you kind of the human trafficking 101, if you will. I think it's a lot deeper than that. But I think it is, for those who don't have a great level of familiarity with it, you're getting the best of the best. I will say that. So we can move on to the next slide. So these are my questions that I'd like to ask you. First, what makes for a good conversation? I've got a slide that I'll pull up, but if you want to add your thoughts to that in the chat, that's obviously more than welcome. And then the question that is a constant self-reflection is, what helps you be present today? And what might be standing in the way? And just check in with yourself. I built in some mindfulness breaks throughout the presentation, but continuing to ask yourself those questions. And if there's something standing in the way, is there a conversation that can be engaged that helps you relate what's standing in the way with the presentation itself? So don't check that and then throw it aside. Ask yourself if that actually might help you be more present. So we'll go into the discussion of the Brene Brown video. And then, like I said, I'm going to hand over the mic. And then we've got 11:10, I've got a mindfulness break and a bio break if you need it too. So, and then we'll reconvene at 11:20. I'll do a 2-minute breathing meditation for those who would like to participate. And then we'll get back into the Human Trafficking 101. Finally, I'll relate it to school communities, and then we'll break for lunch at noon. So we can move on to the next slide. Yeah, so these are kind of, I've asked this question in a lot of different contexts, a lot of different settings, and these are kind of the themes that emerge continuously and consistently. So respect for the other's dignity, right? You start from that place, from that core foundation of seeing the other not as another, but as part of that relationship that you're building through the good conversation. Curiosity and humility. You'll hear me use the term humble curiosity constantly. That's one of the things that I think is a basic orientation in the world. And I think as you'll hear Dr. Thomas talk about, or Marianne, I'm going to switch to my familiar name with you. You'll hear Marianne discuss this kind of, when you're working with people who live through trauma, what's one of the worst things you can do is when they tell you something, you go, oh my, right? You clutch your pearls. This humble curiosity invites you to not clutch your pearls, but to deeply listen. And this, of course, relates to no judgment. not starting off. And of course we have biases, we have judgment as humans. But it comes from outside of us more often than not. So really looking at that, when those things emerge, when those judgments emerge, take a look at them and don't let them guide that conversation though. Active listening, deep active listening. So listening to hear and understand. You've heard this term 1,000 times. Listening to hear and understand, not to respond. If you're listening to respond, you're not actually listening at that point. Leaning in. I mean this both literally and figuratively. So if we're sitting across from each other, you'll see me actually lean into the conversation. But here in the virtual space, it's more of a figurative activity, right? But I'm leaning into this conversation. And finally, reflecting for understanding. I hear you. This is what I heard you say. That gives you a checkpoint to make sure that you are arriving at some shared meaning. And cognitive empathy. And I say this because cognitive empathy is different. Like when we think of empathy, it's always like, I can understand your experience. Well, oftentimes you can borrow somebody else's shoes, but you don't know how they walk in them. And so I'm always really cautious with this. But cognitive empathy is the seeking to understand. And of course, it relates to everything else that I've just mapped out before this. Operating from a space of grace. We require so much grace, and so we need to give it as well. Oftentimes it's giving more grace than you might receive. But people are going to make some missteps. That's okay. Give them the space to make those missteps. That doesn't mean that you don't address the missteps, but from a place of grace. And of course, we're going to go more into vulnerability shortly, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. But the last one is courage. Conversations aren't safe spaces. I eschew that term because we don't have safe spaces in conversations, but they can be courageous spaces, right? And even brave spaces. Bravery has a certain performance to it. It still requires a defense. These are spaces that we're breaking down those defenses. And so it takes courage to do that in these kind of vulnerable moments. So we can go to the next slide. Again, what helps you be present today? What might be standing in the way? So, anxiety lives in the past and the future, but in the very present moment, when you're here with us right now, everything's okay. We've got you covered. Marianne and I both have you covered. We thought about you when we did this, when we composed this presentation. But just asking yourself again, if there's something standing in the way, bring that to this space with you. That's okay. And then allow that to open you up to a greater sense of presence. We'll move on to the next slide. So if we can run the video, if not, I'll sum it for you. We were having a sound issue earlier. Looks like we may still be having the sound issue. So for those who aren't familiar with Brene Brown's work, I highly recommend just go down that rabbit hole. She's got some pretty tremendous work. Marianne, you're very familiar with her work on vulnerability, and I think that she's pretty tremendous. I think she's very, very thoughtful, and how she talks about this. So let's look at this. How is vulnerability a strength? And Marianne, can I ask you, like, when you're leaning into this conversation to keep it between us, how would you frame that vulnerability as a strength?
Well, I think that makes it's kind of like an oxymoron, right? Nobody really thinks they go together, but it is a strength because in being vulnerable, what I'm doing is I'm saying that I do have something else out there. There's something else out there that I need to learn, that there's something that I can glean from this, and I need a little bit of help. And asking for help is a strength, right? That is a huge strength. And so being vulnerable enough to say, you know what, I'm in this space and there's something else that I need from another human being. That's a strength to be able to say that.
Yeah. And I think too, it's so when we're guarding ourselves, when we're defending ourselves, that's perceived as we're strong, right? But actually it's in the vulnerability that those defenses get broken down. You don't need them anymore. And that's, I think, a really powerful way to, like, I think of a weeping willow and it kind of bends with the weather. It allows you that flexibility. Now, I say that, but I do want to note the caveat that we're going to talk about vulnerabilities in different ways. Systemic vulnerabilities can actually be the Achilles heel, right? Unless they're treated as opportunities. So I think that I really enjoy the opportunity to work with Marianne because both of us kind of come to this work with that lens of knowing that experiencing trauma, having experienced trauma requires that level of vulnerability. And I think it's critically important to maintain that as a foundation for this conversation today. I also think that as educators and school professionals, in order to create healing-centered classrooms, truly healing-centered classrooms, it requires the vulnerability of the educator and this professional. right? To create those school communities are communities, and thus we all require that the work together, right? We need to work together to create those healing centered spaces. And looking at it from a community lens as a full system, it's really important. They're not just your students, they're not just your colleagues, they have full lives outside of that space. So how can you bring that to bear here in a really fruitful, thriving way? So finally, how can it help create healing spaces? And this is what I was just noting, is that you as an educator, or you as a school professional, or you as a community member, somebody who cares about schools and the children and the people that comprise those school communities, what can you do? And I think it starts with that, embracing your own vulnerability, knowing that you don't know everything, nor are you required to. And that was a very truncated version of Brene Brown's full video. It's a different one than the 20-minute one that I would have liked to have shown you, but that's okay. Take a look at that. We'll send it out with the resources. But the quote that I really, really enjoyed when she was studying vulnerability, why are some people content? Why are they confident, even though they've experienced a tremendous amount of trauma? And the thing that she said that I loved was the thing that they had in common was this: they fully embraced vulnerability. They believed that what made them vulnerable made them beautiful. It's not that that thing was beautiful, it wasn't, but who they are now, that's part of their story. And that's part of what makes them incredibly beautiful now. So we can move on to the next slide. And I will hand over the mic.
Awesome. Thank you, Heather. And I think you summed up Brene Brown pretty well there. That was pretty good. So, hey, y'all, my name's Marianne, and we are going to be talking about primarily domestic human sex trafficking. I believe this is 101. It does kind of go a little bit further beyond just a 101. I also want to say that my expertise is primarily in sex trafficking, but a lot of the labor trafficking, there's a lot of crossover here. So a lot of this applies to both. And we're going to be talking about some things that are primarily for adults, but I'm going to try to bring it back to kids for you all as much as I possibly can too. So go ahead, Mordecai, you can move that. Thank you. Let's talk about the legal definition. Human sex trafficking is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people through force, fraud, or coercion with the aim of exploiting them for the exchange of anything of value. I want to break down all of that for you real quick. When they say the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people, sometimes people think that that means you have to move a person for them to be trafficked. And that's not true at all. The movement of a person across a border is actually a crime against a border, and that's called smuggling. For human trafficking, it has to have these other components. Now, often smuggling and trafficking go hand in hand, right? It often happens simultaneously. But the trafficking piece of this is how we can prove it in a court of law, is that there was a person that they were forced, fraud, or coerced to do something exploitive for an exchange in some way, okay? And so now let's talk about force, fraud, and coercion. Those are our three legal definitions. Here's my disclaimer. It's in the box below. If they are children under the age of 18, you don't need to prove force, fraud, or coercion for this to be legally defined as human trafficking. This is just for the adult piece. But force, fraud, and coercion. Force is just like you think. I grabbed you, I snatched you, I've done something to physically restrain you. Can also be through something like drugs. I am forcing you to stay in this space and you really can't leave. It can be something through fraud. Some very common things would be in sex trafficking, promises of a modeling job in which no modeling actually occurs, or it's only modeling for a little bit. In labor trafficking, that looks like those door-to-door sales people. They're teenagers though, and they're trying to get like a trip out of the country, or they're trying to win some sort of prize. That is typically labor trafficking. And so that is the fraud. They are telling them that there is a job attached that really isn't there. And then coercion, which is the hardest one to prove, but that happens a lot when they are just threatening things. They're not actually doing things. I'm going to harm your family. I'm going to harm you. I'm going to go after your sister next, or your child, or your grandmother, or your brother, or whatever. And so that is the coercion piece. The aim of exploiting them, and we're going to get into exploiting them, for the exchange of anything of value. And so what I really want you to hear there is, what do we hold valuable? Often we think that's money, but when we start talking about our basic needs, anything of value can be a cheeseburger. It can be a roof over your head. It can just be what you perceive as safety. So that is our legal definition of human trafficking that we're going to use moving forward. All right, Mordecai, thanks. Proper terminology. This is what you will hear me say, and I would appreciate it if you also said these things. We don't say child prostitution. The quick reason for that is because children cannot consent to sex, and so therefore they can't consent to selling sex. There's no such thing as child prostitution. It is commercial sexual exploitation of children. And we're doing a good job at getting our verbiage changed in the legal realm as well. We don't say pornography because often those people who are in those videos are not there by their own choice. That is sexual abuse material. Same with when it comes to the children, it would be child sexual abuse material. And we don't call people a prostitute in this space. There's another space where that term might be appropriate, but not in this space. In this space, it is an exploited person. You will also hear me intertwine that with survivor and victim. That is also because of my lived experience. And so that is my own personal experience that comes out in my verbiage. And then we also say that that person exited trafficking. The reason for that is because anyone who leaves that life does it with a lot of hard work on their own. Yes, there may be people that help them, but if they aren't doing the work, 80% go back into the life, right? And so because of that, we person first, right? We give them back their own stuff instead of people taking it from us and saying that they rescued us or recovered us or saved us. And we'll talk about where that language might be appropriate sometimes, but not really in our space. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some of the numbers, and these numbers do come from Polaris.org. You can look them up. They stay pretty on point with their numbers. You can also check sharedhope.org if you want to know where in your state there are hotbeds of trafficking or what the numbers are for your particular state. Sharedhope.org does a great job of keeping annually, they'll put those numbers out for you. So first of all, in the movies, what do you hear about sex trafficking? It is like a snatch and grab. Somebody kidnapped the person, took them to another country possibly, and then sold them for sex. Here is what we know in the US. Most people are trafficked by someone who they already know. 29% are partner related. So that's an intimate partner, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, whatever that might be, or a family member. 46% is a family member. And as we're talking about children, that is important to note because family is not always a safe space. Family can be what you would typically think of a mom and dad. It's also that extended family, or in single parent households, it's also new family who have come into the original family unit. Most people are lured away by a trafficker rather than being kidnapped. Again, the movies do a great job of showing those kidnap scenes and they're very exciting, but it's not a good business model. If I wanted to traffic someone, if I'm kidnapping everyone, you're going to call the cops. People are going to see, right? It's not a good business model. A much better business model is for the trafficker to befriend that person. Go back to that first one, right? Someone that they know, they befriend them first. They become that intimate partner first. And all along, this is the plan. 97% are lured away because if I can convince you to walk away with me, people aren't going to look for you quite as closely as they would if I just snatched you and grabbed you off the street. 97% are lured away. Most people are recruited and groomed in early childhood. The average age of recruitment is elementary school, and that's very important. Grooming is that process. What I'm talking about, them luring somebody away, it starts so easy. It starts with a simple, hey, how are you? And a friendship or a small relationship begins. It starts easy and slow because the trafficker has the time. They know that they can start working on this child at an early age so that it looks like the child made some decisions and walked away and got into some bad stuff, even though someone had been prepping their brain for this all along. Most trafficking starts where the physical acts occur in early teen years. The average age of entry is 12 years old. I think that is female statistics. Males, it would be younger, I believe. I believe it is 10 for males. And we don't have accurate statistics for any other genders. The US is the #1 purchaser of people for sex. And this can hurt a little bit, right? Because we want to believe it happened somewhere else. We want to believe that the bad guys are somewhere else. But what we know is that the US, we buy more people for sex here locally in our own country, but we also go on sexual tourism vacations also just to purchase people. And the reason why I say the purchase of a person is because it is never just about sex. It just isn't. Once those two individuals walk into whatever space that might be that they're going to be in, the person who is the buyer has all of the power. They decide if they're going to pay or not. They decide what acts will occur. They decide if that victim is even allowed to leave that room ever again. And so that's why we don't say that they purchase sex. They are actually purchasing a person and then choosing what to do during the time that they have that person in that space. Next slide, please. So here's how it works. It is a triangle. I have to have a trafficker, I have to have a buyer, and I have to have a victim, right? It doesn't work without one of those. It just doesn't work. So how does that work? It is demand driven. If I wanted to sell you my bottle of water right now, I could not force you to buy it. There's nothing I could do except maybe really do something bad, right? To force you to buy it. And that's not what's happening. Buyers are searching this out. Traffickers are responding to a demand that is already there. Buyers search this out. If there were not buyers, this would go away. It is greed driven. The same people who maybe used to sell drugs or used to sell illegal arms are now selling people. And the reason for that is because it's easier. If I sell some drugs, I can sell it one time and it's gone forever. I can sell a human being multiple times, 24 hours a day, and it's something that doesn't ever go away. And so a lot of the people who are involved in this have caught on to that, and it is quickly overcoming trafficking of drugs in illicit gains. It's at $150 billion per year right now. Next slide, please. Here are our people, the trafficker, the person who does the exploitation through sex or labor for their personal gain. Often people think that that exploited person gets to go home with some of that money. That is very rare. And so that's also something to consider. The trafficker will also use things like a roof over the exploited person's head or food in their belly. And that's another way that they're controlling them. The buyer, of course, is the person who purchases another person for sex. And then, of course, the exploited person, the person who is being trafficked and or exploited. Below are some of the terms that you will usually hear in the life. You'll hear me say in the life because I was a part of it. And that's just another terminology that we would have used for the people who had gone through similar situations. I don't recommend you saying any of these words. These are not nice words. You will hear me say victim and survivor. I'm also not a fan of either of those. I will be the first one to say that. I just don't have better verbiage in this space. So next slide, please. And we're going to talk about common methods of entry because I said they have to get to know you. So how are they doing that? Friends and family is one. It might be already a generational thing. It might be an area thing. You don't know. It could be something that's already going on, or it can be somebody who comes into the friends and family's lives. It can be a new person who enters into that space. But our #1 way of becoming a friend right now in this space is through social media and video games. When somebody becomes a friend for our kids right now, often it starts online, right? They have all these friends on social media. They have all these friends on their video game platforms. That's the same way traffickers are going after children. I met one trafficker after he was arrested. He said that he would send out 100 good morning, beautiful texts across different social medias to little girls he did not know. And anybody who answered became a target because they responded. If they didn't answer, he moved on to the next 100 tomorrow. But anyone who answered became a target for that slow pushing and pulling while they're saying, hey, you're so nice. I'd like to be your friend. I'd like to hang out with you. Let's go do this. Let's go do that. They're also saying things like, your mom and dad don't understand you. Your grandma's really not very nice to you. Didn't your teacher make you feel bad the other day? And I think you're really smart. And they're saying those things so that they're pushing away the safe people while they're pulling the child closer and closer to them. For boys, video games is number one right now because of the fact that in those chat features, people aren't paying attention. We started paying attention a little bit to social media, but those chat features on the video games, they're inviting the kids into new spaces. They're asking them to talk in other rooms, and kids, they just want to have friends. But then that's how they fall into that friend category again. I think I know this person, therefore now I can go meet this person in public. And then, of course, sexual abuse material. People who want to harm another person use this for teaching so that they can show the child what acts to perform, how to do it. But they also use it as a means into the world. Most survivors will tell you that before an act occurred, a picture occurred. And so they're starting them with something easy. Go back to that social media for a teen girl. She might say, the trafficker I knew might say something like, hey, you look really pretty. Show me your school outfit today. And then with some time and some more, oh, show me your pretty smile. Show me how you did your hair. Then it turns into, let me see your bathing suit. And then it turns into, let me see more. And so it begins with the picture, and it's that grooming. It is that slow pushing of boundaries so that once you're in, you don't even know how you got there. Next slide, please. Some of the common identifiers, and I wish that I could tell you, here's exactly what you need to go look for. Go find this, but I really can't. So I'm going to tell you what you can look for that would really raise the hair on the back of your neck and make you think, I should look further into this. Any obvious power differential, and this can be very obvious, right? The holding of identification, but it's also sometimes pretty subtle, like in controlling of speech. Sometimes that's obvious, but it can also be in a subtle glance when you see the victim look up at their trafficker before responding. It can be in the controlling of movement in the things like, I have rules that I have to follow, and it just looks like they're being obedient to a superior or to a parent, something like that. Like, I must be home at a certain time, can also sound a little bit too controlling in the right space. Brandings, tattoos, and jewelry, these are things that we've been saying for years. Traffickers really do like to brand. They want people to know who all of their victims are, and they like their brand. And so they want to brand what they have. So that used to be an actual brand where they burnt it into the person's skin. It could have been tattoos. But lately what they're doing is it's switching to jewelry, because what also is happening on the back end is once a trafficker was picked up and was going through the court processes, we could then identify other victims by the brand on the victim. And the traffickers caught on to that. And so now they've had them switch to jewelry, like necklaces or bracelets, something like that. Something that if the girl or boy gets arrested, they yank that off and they drop it in the street so that the trafficker doesn't get in trouble. But here's where we're really going to sit. And it's in those vulnerabilities. And these are going to become strengths for people. I can attest to that. But as children and as people who are living through them, they're vulnerabilities that traffickers are exploiting. So we're going to get into those a little bit further. Next slide, please. If you haven't yet heard of it, this is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Test. You can Google this and you can take it. And the questions might vary just slightly a little bit on the phrasing, but it's the same basic 10 questions. You answer yes or no, and 4 or more yeses says that you are more vulnerable for a lot of things. Human trafficking is one of them, again, because that's how the traffickers exploit you. But you're also susceptible to other things. You are more vulnerable to different health conditions like diabetes or obesity. You are 1,200% more likely to at least attempt suicide, right? These things add up when a child, because we're talking about children, when a child goes through them. This test was devised in hindsight after they saw some things that they were like, hey, this is pretty common to these populations. Then they backed up and started looking at what had caused all of those conditions. And what they said is before the age of 18, if people have 4 or more of these, that means they are more susceptible to some things. And so when you're reading over this list, think of the things that a trafficker could use to exploit a person. The first 3 are easy, right? If there's already abuse going on, the trafficker just leans into that because that person is way more vulnerable to more abuse. Lack of safety and security, lack of those basic needs, food, shelter, clothing. Trafficker is going to swoop right in and supply all of that for you. Single parent homes are not bad, right? What the problem is are the people who are going to latch on to that because a single parent is busy and can get distracted. We can all get distracted, right? But a trafficker will swoop in and look like they are a rescuer and a hero and the whole time have evil things in mind. Domestic violence in the home, just witnessing abuse can lead you susceptible for being abused. And so you can read the rest of those. Next slide, please.
Let's pause for just a minute and
Sure.
just take any questions that maybe if people have. I also want to note some of the comments that have come up. So Erin, thank you so much. I sent you that note, but it's one of the things when we talk about kind of tribal communities, it's a huge conversation. And I think that Marianne and I probably can't do any kind of justice to that today in the course of this conversation, but it's one of the things that we'd like to develop. We'd like to develop that conversation further and present that as its own kind of session, given the, like I said there, given the tremendous complexity of the issue. So, and I noted, Sujita, thank you so much for your comment too, that ACES has actually expanded. They're continuing to learn and evolve. And it's really, I think, tremendously beneficial to have had that kind of greater depth that has been developed. So did anybody else have any questions though, that they wanted to pop into the chat? We'll take those for a minute or two and then move right back into the presentation. I also wanted to note Mary's comment in the Q&A. That was, that's going to be 12 o'clock Central Time for the break for an hour. So, sure.
That is a very important question.
Yeah, no doubt. We all need it. So I also wanted to note that Mary in the Q&A engagement through Zoom asked if it could be other things that can be the controlling factor besides financial. And Marianne, I think you did a pretty good job of leaning into that. So I won't belabor that point, but yes, emotional control, that kind of feeding the egos and those fragile egos at that age. I think you pointed really nicely to, yes, the grooming process is very much about that. It may not be financial or may not be pragmatic, but you'll get into that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I'm not going to take over that and answer it, give away all the answers before we get to the slide. Previous slide, just to take a picture. Sure. Samantha, immigration is also a major issue. We regularly see yep, and we'll get into that too as one of those vulnerabilities is, language, a feeling of, one's undocumented status can put them at risk. So thank you for that. Okay, I'll hand it back to you, Marianne. We'll keep an eye on the chat. We've got the help of our colleagues. So intellectual disabilities, we're not going into depth, but yes, recognizing that's one of those vulnerabilities. Absolutely.
And that's exactly why this is a 101, because it's the general scope of everything. All of those other populations that I'm hearing, that's an added vulnerability that gets preyed upon. And that's just not the scope of this particular topic. because we're just going to hit the overview of everything. But I
Yeah.
love where your minds are going, and I can hear that you're thinking about the people you see every day and seeing how this applies to them. And that's exactly what I want, is for you to be recognizing this in your own populations that you live in, work in, breathe in. So let's talk about how they do some of that controlling, because again, back to the movies, they want to show someone that's chained up or tied up. That's also not a good business plan, right? And if you're selling a person, often you want that person to look a little bit better, right? And so you don't want them to look like that. You don't want them to look all beat down and trodden, which is also one of the ways that it's able to hide in plain sight. So let's talk about the control tactics. Physical and emotional abuse and threats. That is one way to control a person. And it does just say threats, because a person can threaten a person without saying a word and just walk around with a weapon in their hand all the time. That is a threat. That is enough of a threat to scare a person into doing whatever that violent person may or may not want. So it's the physical and emotional abuse and threats. It's also that isolation from safe people. Remember, I talked about that push and pull. It is much easier to control a person when you've stripped away all the other people around them. They don't have anyone else to depend on but the trafficker at that point. And so that is part of what happens, is if they can pull them all the way in, that's the way that they are able to, because who's going to see, right? Who's going to know? Who's going to look? The buyers aren't going to care. And often in society, I'm going to say we in this case, because I identify as this, we are the people you don't want to look at, right? We are actively trying to hide, and you don't really want to see us anyhow in our stuff. And then of course, the economic abuse. I'm going to throw in another one here. Spiritual abuse is another one that we don't talk about very often. And that can also touch on some of the populations that you guys, I saw pull up in the chat too. That's another way that they can control people. So next slide, please. So how does someone leave the life? How do they walk away from that? It is not easy. You heard me say 80% recidivism. We don't know how accurate our stats are, right? Because not a lot of us are reporting back, but that's what we can gather through social services that are being performed. 80% go back into the life. Something has to intervene for us to walk away. Something has to intervene. Often that can be law enforcement. There are a lot of crimes committed. It could be prostitution as a crime, but there are also other petty thefts are involved. There are drug crimes involved. There are other crimes involved where law enforcement and victims and survivors cross paths. Part of that is a detox or a rehab facility or any other, even Baker Acts, facilities like that, because often people who are being trafficked are either forced to do drugs or are using drugs to numb out what is happening to them, and they end up in a detox. They might, because of drug use, also end up in a Baker Act is in Florida, I should change that, in a mental health facility, a 72-hour mental health facility, so that they can even out for a bit. And so that's another place that someone can intervene and see what's going on. Service providers also can intervene, but often how do service providers even find these people? It's because they've already had some sort of interaction with law enforcement or detox. Churches often jump into the fight in anti-trafficking. Oftentimes churches have pantries and stuff like that where a victim might show up. And that's another space where they might encounter a victim. Any sort of medical facility, often STDs are a part of the life, miscarriages are a part of the life, abortions are a part of the life. And so these are reasons, physical injuries are a part of the life. These are reasons where a person might end up in an emergency room in some sort of doctor's office. Educators and school professionals, that is part of my own personal history, is I was being trafficked as a teenager I was still going to school every day, right? And there are things that I wish people had seen in me. And I know that as educators, as people who have that day-to-day interaction with children, you have the best chance at actually building the relationship. Because if I'm 15 and I just got arrested, I'm probably not going to listen to that cop a whole lot. If I'm 12 and I have to hit a detox, I don't want to hear what they have to say either. And I could probably poo-poo a lot of service providers because I don't think they have a lot invested in me, right? But you do, because you're already doing it every day. You're already building the relationship. And that's the part that's critical to help us stay out of the life, is that new relationship. Because we already talked about how a lot of the people in our past might not be healthy for us. New relationships is where we need to grow and learn. And so you have a great chance at really being instrumental in helping a kid walk away from this world. Next slide, please. We're going to break down each of these a little bit further, but this is really what it takes to build a strong foundation after being trafficked. First, you have to consider the level of trauma a person has, and that's different. A singular trauma is a lot different than a trauma that occurred daily for weeks or months or years. Addiction, it's a natural part of the life. Again, addiction can be a number that helps you make it through that life alive. Medical issues. Did we ever see a doctor? Maybe we did, maybe we didn't. Maybe we have too many diagnoses, right? There's other things going on there. Housing, where are we going to live? Especially if the trafficking came from somebody who was supposed to be a support in our lives. Education, how far did we go in school, and were we actually paying attention while we were there, or were we just surviving? Economic stability, how are we going to keep ourselves going from here, right? Those criminal charges are going to haunt us. Who are our healthy people? And then did we exit the life with kids? So next slide. Here is trauma. These things are going to get in the way of our own healing. And what happens is, while we are still stuck with a lot of this, those old patterns of behavior actually work for us pretty well, because they were working for us. They kept us alive and they kept us here. And so it's very hard for us to break free of that. One of those problems is the trauma bond. Who was my trafficker? Who were my buyers? Were they people who I had come to depend on that I thought were safe people in my life? Were they people that I actually thought, you've heard of Stockholm Syndrome, same thing, right? Were they people who I had connected with, and now I don't know how to separate the fact that what they did was wrong and the fact that I have these very strong feelings for them? Oops, excuse me. And then my dog. Common diagnoses that we might, excuse me one second. Okay, sorry about that, y'all. Common diagnoses. These are things that we might come out of the life with, or we might be diagnosed while we're in the life, but I want you to think about what these mean. Post-traumatic stress disorder. That was very stressful, right? It was very traumatic. Bipolar disorder. Are my moods fluctuating? Am I responding to abuse? That sounds like that might be a response to abuse also, right? Borderline personality disorder. Strong attachments to people with no reason, right? That also sounds like something that came from trafficking. Depression and anxiety. If you're in survival every day, those would be normal things. And my favorite for my under 18 crowd, the oppositional defiant disorder. If you have been abused for days and weeks and months and years, you're probably going to get pretty defiant at some point. That's actually a survival skill. What all these add up to is really complex PTSD. That's not yet in the DSM. It should be coming in the next one. But that is really what this is. It's not all of these things. A person doesn't have all of these things happening. What we're really looking at is a reaction to all of the trauma they experience. These are normal responses and survival skills to the trauma. And so that's why we are trying to change that diagnosis a little bit. Can you go back a slide for me? Thank you. And then Finding a competent trauma therapist. There's nothing harder for a survivor than to walk into a space with a person who does not understand complex trauma and then be told, oh, I don't know what I'm doing in this space, which is the nice way to do it. Or even worse, oh, hey, I'm going to try to muddle through this, even though I have no idea how to handle the things that you've been through. And there just aren't that many people in this space with complex trauma like this yet. And it's a new thing, right? We're learning so much about it every day. And often once we're already in our fields, we tend to forget to keep learning and growing. And so that's another thing is we need better education to help the counselors out there who are already amazing understand what this actually means. We also, and I speak for us and myself, right? We have to be willing to participate fully in therapy because it hurts to heal. Yes, bad things happen to me. However, that is not the world's fault, right? I have to be willing to work on all of my stuff, that those vulnerabilities, how do I turn those into strengths? And then also, how did I play a part in this? Maybe not in the initial, but where were my patterns, my survival skills that kept leading me down that same path? And how do I change those survival skills that I no longer need? Which is hard, right? And takes time. And then, of course, any sexual trauma relating back to the body, connecting back to your body. You hear the term dissociation. It's a very common thing for people who have been trafficked. They can separate themselves from their body so that whatever is happening isn't really happening anymore. And that is something that served them well. But it goes back to that I have to change some things, right? That is not a skill that I need to carry on into my future. And so a lot of the healing from physical trauma is in reconnecting back to the body. And we do that with body up therapies and things like yoga and stuff like that, ways where you learn to move your body again and really feel. And part of that is not just in movement, it's in learning to sit still in a space, which is another important skill to learn. Next slide, please.
Let's take a couple of questions that we've
Yeah.
got Q&A there too. Do you think a homeless shelter can be an agency of intervention? I think you and I would agree that absolutely, right?
Absolutely.
Especially, but that requires some training for those folks running homeless shelters. I worked in the space of working with folks who are unhoused for quite some time. And as everybody on this call probably knows, there's some really great people doing wonderful work out there. There's also some real bad stuff going on, right? I mean, there are people who don't understand things like when somebody's been unhoused for a long period of time, when there's a definite intersection of that in human trafficking. And so having that awareness is really critically important in order for them to respond responsibly. So I think also, Mitch, you had a question, are neurodivergent individuals more vulnerable? I think it depends on the neurodivergence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that goes along with any of those populations. I saw somebody said special needs somewhere. That's another.
Yep.
Yeah. Not any sort of barriers, language barriers, housing pick a barrier, right?
Absolutely.
Pick a barrier.
Absolutely. And I think with neurodivergence and a lot of like, those are vulnerabilities, but they're also profound strengths. That's why we kind of started with that notion of vulnerability as strength. That's, you know, as somebody with ADHD, I can tell you, I know when it's a moment of strength. But I also know when it's hampered me for sure. So it can create increased anxiety. So I think, Mitch, I think your question was well put. Yes, I think absolutely. Marianne, would you agree with that?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm looking here too. I see many of our sober living facilities are fronts for trafficking here. Judy, you've made several comments, and I think you're onto something there. Yeah, I think that becomes kind of a hotbed because you have people who have survived and they're all living together. And Marianne, I'll let you speak to that a little bit more than I will.
That turns into a few things, right? There can be recruitment within the facility that happens. That there's recruitment within the facility, but also traffickers prey on vulnerabilities. And as you are leaving that facility, who's standing right outside to help you back on that path again, right? It's a trafficker. We see them stand right outside of jail. So as someone is released, right there, they're standing right there across the street.
Right.
And
Career
on
source.
that vulnerability.
Yeah.
Yes.
Where people are looking for jobs.
Yes.
Yeah. The brilliant recruitment strategy, right? Yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk some, Brenda, about labor trafficking. I'm going to offer an overview. Marianne's expertise is really in sex trafficking, but with the knowledge that none of these are, it's not an either or proposition. There's great overlap and intersections that happen between various kinds of trafficking.
And often it's both. They happen concurrently, or one leads to the other in some way. Labor trafficking can actually be kind of an on-ramp into sex trafficking for a lot of people. And so, yeah, unfortunately, it's often co-occurring. Do you want me to keep going, or do we have more questions?
Yeah, I think we can move forward with the presentation.
Okay. So addiction, right? It's actually something that helps a person survive some horrific things. So when somebody exits the life, they might have drug or alcohol problems. That might require them to go somewhere for a while. And there are not enough rehab facilities with co-occurring disorders where they can also work on their trauma. Often it's let's focus on what is right before us, which is the addiction, the immediate need. That is a safety concern, right? We need to make sure this person is here tomorrow. That's the first need. And so then the trauma comes later. We worry about that afterwards. And then often, like you were just saying, they don't always recognize or understand that human trafficking is happening right around them, that they don't recognize it when they see it. They don't recognize the extra vulnerability that a victim would have in that space, even that they would be even more vulnerable in that space with other people who are vulnerable. And then most people attempt to quit their addiction multiple times before they are successful, right? We all know that it takes several touches before it sticks. The numbers for addiction, the numbers for domestic violence are pretty close in how many attempts it takes. They're saying the same about trafficking with that 80%, but I think we all know that all of those numbers are a lot higher. We just don't get accurate data for all of that. Next slide, please. Medical things. Some of the people, and I'm going to try to keep this for kids for you guys, but some people may never have seen a doctor or a dentist. That could be part of it. And the reason for that is if it's parents who are trafficking a kid, they don't want a medical provider to see anything on this kid. The kid could have STDs. They could have other things going on. They could have broken bones that healed on their own. They don't want eyes on them from the state, from the government. And so that person will never go see a doctor or a dentist. Because of that, they may have many undiagnosed medical issues. And as long as they're sitting there, you just push through. Everything gets pushed through. Or the other end of the spectrum, they might have overused medical professionals. This is usually as they get older and into adulthood, where they are constantly getting picked up for those mental health 3-day stays, or they are doctor shopping or pill searching. That is usually when they are a little bit older because the kids don't have access to all of that. But those things from childhood tend to lead to those kinds of behaviors. And then also, this is an attention-seeking thing, that if I am sick, people will pay attention to me. If there is something wrong with me, people will care for me and protect me and love me. And so they can exaggerate a lot of that. One of those things are things like miscarriages and abortions, pregnancies in general. That is one of the things that gets exaggerated a lot, especially in teens, because that is something that makes us pay attention. We as a society want to see life created. And so we praise new life. And so that can be another thing that a kid might use to try to get some attention. Next slide. Thank you. Housing becomes difficult for even children when wasn't safe, right? When the place they came from wasn't a place they can go back to. And that can be because parents or family was involved. Maybe the neighborhood is an unsafe place. So you'll hear the term safe homes. That's something that we have for people who need safety, right? That makes sense. That is a lot of oversight. It has things like no cell phones, no outside communications. They might have blackout times where you can't talk to anybody, you know, while they're trying to help you distinguish who is actually safe in your world. And so that is for a specific amount of time. That is for people who need healing and a lot of protection. And they do great work. They're not intended to be forever, though. They're intended to be short-term, 6 to 9 months. And then the person could move on to something like transitional housing. For kids, this is when you'll start seeing things like group homes, where all of the kids are living together in one space. That meets a need as far as a roof over a kid's head, but often they're not so great because it goes back to that whole thing, like we said about the sober living facilities. Now I have a whole bunch of people with trauma in the same space, and they can feed off of each other and learn from each other, and that can fester and grow even further. You'll see a lot of recruitment in places like that also.
There's also a lot, really quick, from the juvenile justice space and child welfare, when that intersection happens and you have kids who've been dually impacted by those systems of care. I'm going to put some scare quotes around that, even though the people who work their care deeply, the kids who experience those systems don't find them to be very caring spaces, nor do they find them to be safe spaces. And so I think many of you probably here have worked with young people who've been dually impacted by all the systems that are in place. And I just wanted to note that because I remember this being a huge hotbed, the kids who were living at that intersection, huge hotbed, living in allegedly safe homes, huge hotbed for trafficking. So I just wanted to note
Absolutely. Our best alternative is affordable housing communities that offer wraparound services. That, of course, would be for adults, right? Affordable housing communities. For our kids, though, think about what they don't have. They don't have that community. Why do I think this is the best method for adults? Because it's building a new community. So for our kids, we have to teach them how to build that new community when they don't have a lot of power over what their community looks like. They might not have power over where they live. So it's teaching them how to find those safe spaces where they build a relational community even before they can build a physical community. And then education. If we're talking about kids, no, they probably haven't graduated yet. However, even if they're sitting in a classroom, trauma changes how a person learns. While I am in survival mode, I can't learn algebra. While I am in survival mode, whatever you are doing to teach me, I might do okay right now, but it's not going to stick very well because I have to survive. My entire being is focused on survival. And so really smart kids do things like fail classes, not because they can't learn, but because they're in and out of school quite often. Or even if they're sitting in a school setting, they're in survival mode in their brain and they just can't take it all in that space. Usually once they can leave that space, they go on to do great things. But during that time, they're just not learning, but that means a lot. It's not just in their education, that's also their life skills. They're not learning the things that they need to learn to take care of themselves really out on those streets, except for by those street people. And so this can really impact somebody as they're trying to exit. Next slide. Economic stability. This again is more geared to our adults, but they might need to learn new skills. For a lot of our kids, they do end up dropping out of high school. That's part of their path. How are they going to take care of themselves? Go back to that. We all 80% fall back into the life. This is one of the biggest reasons. If I don't know how to provide for myself, I have to go back to what I know. I have to go back to the only thing that has ever provided for me. That includes things like budgeting. If I'm used to, I go out on the streets and that's how I make money to pay my electric bill today. And now I have a job working, at Costco, and I want to budget my every 2-week paycheck. I might not know how to do that yet, right? I'm used to daily money. I don't know how to do that yet. And so there's a lot of learning in how to budget and also distinguish needs from wants, because a lot of the stuff that you're taught are needs really aren't.
I just want to note too that there's a growing conversation around trauma-informed banking. So there's a Fifth Third's Bank and another banking institution I'm not going to remember during the course of this conversation, but there are two growing conversations where they're like, what does that look like? That's, that means not just having a customer, it means having a client relationship with the person and looking at pattern detection. I can see now this is dipping. That's going to show you that there's a possible vulnerability there. So I just
And
I went on mute.
something else that's important to say with this is when it's familial trafficking, they might be, or even if it's not familial trafficking, if it's relational trafficking in some way, they also might be using this person's identity to ruin everything for their financial future. They might have credit cards taken out in their name, homes, electricity, utilities, all of that might be in the victim's name, so that when they do exit the life, they have this mountain of debt that was through no fault of their own. Criminal charges. This is something that has to be addressed because crimes are committed. And so there are consequences to actions. During the course of somebody committing the crime, they might go to jail. They might have probation. Those are all things that you have to disclose when you try to get a job, right? They can get in the way of you getting a job. So you might not be very easily employable because of that. You also might not be able to go to certain schools because of that. That's another thing that can get in the way of some educational things. If you had the hopes of being certain professions as you were growing up and you were in the life, and this is the result of part of your life, that can get in the way of a job that you had really wanted. Now, there are ways out of it. Kids is a different thing, unless it's a violent crime, close, then they are, once they turn 18, that much of that is now not something that employers would see. Now, for them, the problem is that when I turned 18, no magic happened, right? I didn't instantly become a different person. And I'm going to guess you didn't either. So if I was committing crimes at 15 and 16 and 17 and getting a slap on the wrist, when I turn 18, that slap on the wrist is no more, right? This is now following me, and now it's a pattern of behavior for me. If someone is committing crimes while in the place of also being trafficked, there are expunction processes. However, they can take years. And in that time that you're trying to prove that you were trafficked to get this taken off of your record, you still may not be able to get a job. Or housing, when we go back to housing, if I'm trying to get low income housing, I can't have these criminal charges on my record. That's another thing getting in my way, another vulnerability that I have. And so that's why it's nice that we're doing this, the expunction process, but also it's not near enough because people are still being forced back into the life due to basic needs. Next one. Thank you. And I've talked about this a lot. What does a healthy community look like? My family unit, my community may not be safe, right? I might need to learn how to build a healthy community. I might need someone to show me like a pro and con. Put good qualities here, put bad qualities here. Now start lining up the people in your life and see where they're fitting with those qualities, right? Maybe I need to learn those skills, but also it's very important for anybody who's been through some stuff, let's say, to have support groups. And I'm not saying you have to join some frou-frou thing, right? I'm not talking about that. I'm saying that you have people who have similar life experience, who have traveled a path a little bit further than you already, and can be a champion in your corner, because we all need to feel a little less alone in the world, and having people around you who can also identify with some of the things you've been through can be a great support so that you don't feel so alone in some really icky stuff, right? So that you're able to have the wisdom of people who truly understand what you have been through, and so that you can also give back to those other people at the same time. Did you want to say something there, Heather? Oh, okay. Okay. And then parenting. Often people exit the life with children, and this does mean even teenagers, right? They have not yet learned how to parent. Whether I'm an adult or a child exiting the life with a child, I probably didn't have a lot of skills for parenting. Again, my brain's in survival mode. My brain is not in, how do I do this well? How do I care for this person well? And if I'm a person who grew up in this sort of life, in these sort of vulnerabilities, maybe I don't really know what well looks like, right? I might think something is a good idea, but it's just because that's what's always been done. It's not because I have anything to frame it against. And so there might be skills that are that still need to be learned, because this is actually generational. We know that all of these traumas, all of those vulnerabilities from the ACEs are generational. That's why we look at it like that. So many of the children have their own trauma that needs to be addressed. You can get me out of the life, but my kid already saw too much and already heard too much and was already involved in too much. And even if I leave and you're concentrating on services for me, often the kids get forgotten that they had their own trauma outside of whatever mom or dad or whomever went through. And then here's the hardest part. You might have to learn how to co-parent with an abuser. That's just the way it is. Often a trafficker will have a person have their child because it's another form of control. And so what do you do if you exit the life and now you have to parent with someone who is abusive? Because the child also still has rights to both parents. And that's a very real thing that we see every day in my world, that we are still trying to figure out a lot. And it's not black and white. And I wish that things were easy like that, but there is so much gray area. And so we're still working on that part. Next slide, please.
Yeah, actually, before we do that, I actually have us scheduled for a short break.
Oh,
So
good.
people need to take a bio break. We'll do a breathing meditation for 2 minutes, and then we'll hop back in. It's a lot of material, and I think the chat is blowing up, so we can spend a minute with that too. I love the amount of participation I'm seeing. I like seeing a couple people connected with each other. You're right around the corner from each other. So as I noted in the chat, this work at all levels requires strong communities and thoughtful communities. And I think to Marianne's point about support systems, it might not look like a group that you go to, that survivor group that you go to. But how do you build that support within these broader systems and kind of reimagine that sometimes as needed? So I wanted to pay attention to some of the notes in the chat. Zona, thank you so much for sharing your experience as a survivor in CPSS. I'm hosting trauma-informed recovery and all recovery method in 2 states right now, part in conjunction with domestic violence shelters, which gets back to somebody else's point. Are the interventions for domestic violence similar to the interventions for human trafficking? Yes, I would say so, but they're still distinct traumas. And so they need to be treated with those very distinct relational interventions that respond to the situation at hand. Of course, there are intersections. A lot of times trafficking involves domestic violence. So, I mean, inherently it does, but somebody who's a domestic violence survivor still looks different from the kind of complex trauma that the trafficking survivor experiences. So can parental rights be terminated if there is a history of abuse, exploitation? I would imagine so. I think we would need to speak with our legal experts, but I know it's a process.
Well, and it depends on who the victim is, because if the child is not the victim, then that is usually not a reason to terminate parental rights. At least I can speak for the state of Florida, that if the child would have to be the victim in that case.
Yeah. So I think we've covered the questions. We can take we've got 6 more messages. I love that people are using this.
I love how many people are self-identifying here and saying, hey, this also happened to me, because like I said, it takes a community, and that buoys me also when I say, hey, see, there's another one. That's someone else who gets it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Pramila, you had some questions about specific interventions, and I think we're going to touch on that, but we can always talk with you further offline and go into a kind of deeper dive into that. Okay, so we'll take just we'll reconvene at 12:30, and then we'll have a 2-minute. I'm looking at my computer, 12:30 Eastern time, 11:30 Central. So I keep forgetting we have people from all kinds of different time zones here. So, and then we'll do the 2-minute breathing meditation just to kind of, recalibrate and dive right back into it when helping hurts. Okay, so for those of you who are joining me for the breathing meditation, one of the reasons Marianne pointed earlier to the sometimes it's difficult to be still. This is an opportunity for that stillness. So if you're joining me, just here's my very basic instructions: feet flat on the floor, and then if you put your hands down, it's offering grounding. And if you do them palm up, it's an opening. So whatever you need to do for that, and then just all you're doing is breathing, easiest thing in the world, right? So take a deep breath in and out, get rid of it all, and then we're going to do a countdown. So let go of it. Then you're going to start breathing into the count of 6. So 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold it at the top for a count of 2, and then let it out for a count of 8. So 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then again, breathe into the count of 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hold it at the top, 2, 1, and release it. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're going to do one more of these. Breathe into the count of 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And one deep breath in, let it all out. And then we'll dive back in.
Awesome. Thank you. So now we're going to talk about when helping hurts, because I know you all have big hearts, right? You want to do something, so we want to help you do it well. Everybody says, what can I do? So here's what you can do, right? Because we're not the ones who are going to be doing most of the work for them. So here's how we can do it well. Next slide, please. This is the savior complex. These are how you can recognize it in someone. Things like, I want to rescue, I want to help, I want to give, right? That's a whole lot of I want. And it's not about the person that you're actually saying that you're helping. It's more about how you're going to feel about something. And what a victim hears is that you're above me. You have something that I don't have. You're better off than I am. And so that's not the way we want to approach somebody. You never want to say that you know what's best for a victim, or that you would have done something differently, or that you can fix them. We're people, right? We're not things to be fixed. And you also can't fix the problem, because the problem's human trafficking. And if you can, I'd love to meet you. And then my favorite, I am a voice for the voiceless. I have always had my own voice, I can promise you. I am a face of trafficking. There are millions like me, right? Each person has their own voice. They've always had their own voice. Someone might have tried to silence them. Someone might have tried to stop them, but they've always had their own voice. And so people are not a voice for someone else. You're your own voice. I'm my own voice. And these are phrases that will indicate that maybe somebody doesn't really have the person who you want to help, the person who whatever population that you feel called to. If you want to really serve well in that population, it's not from coming of a position of power. It's actually from building a relationship. It's from coming in at a place of equity, and how can we work together here? Next slide, please. Part of that is having boundaries, and boundaries and enabling go hand in hand. Very good-hearted people with big intentions and great ideas can mess up here, because there are some gray areas, right? There are no black and whites. And so here's what we want you to know. Having appropriate boundaries match the nature of the relationship, right? So is it a friend, or is it a student, or is it someone who you just met, right? What are the appropriate boundaries for that relationship? Because we don't want to cross those. And you allow the survivor to gently fail. Often what we see is somebody wants to come in, it goes back to that rescuer mentality. Someone wants to come in and do everything for a survivor. I'm going to do this and that and something else, right? However, if someone does everything for me, how do I ever learn how to figure it out on my own? Because you're not going to be there forever, right? We are usually temporary in everyone's life. There are very few people in our life that we are going to travel through till the end of time, right? There are very few people. So we have to understand we help them best by actually letting them know how to fall easily, giving them a safe space to land when they fall a little bit. You cannot, and I cannot stress this enough, but you cannot have a stronger emotional reaction to a person's story than that person does. And this can be hard, right? If I wanted to tell you my whole life story right now, it might hurt your feelings a little bit, right? I would say horrific things that people don't want to hear about. And if your natural inclination is to be someone who cries when something upsets them emotionally, you might want to do that. But the problem is, I'm going to tell you my story with a straight face, right? I'm going to say it just like I'm talking to you now. And so when you start crying, what happens is now I'm in the position of making you feel better about how my story affected you. And that's not the relationship we started out with, right? That wasn't the intention of this relationship. And so being able to hear hard things, excuse yourself, if you have to walk away, that's great. You can even say, sometimes it catches you, and you can even say, oh, I wasn't expecting that, thanks for telling me, and compose yourself. Take that breath that Heather just shared with us, right? That's a great time to use that skill so that you can compose yourself a little bit better and then get back into it. You can also say to a person, you know what? I don't think I'm the best person to hear this story. I don't think I'm the best person to help you with this. Let me find someone who can. And that's also an appropriate response. Whenever we are dealing with someone with physical abuse of any kind, physical, sexual abuse, please ask permission before any sort of touch. I actually start every speech that I give in person with, please don't hug me after this. Please do not come up and hug me, because that is people's natural inclination. I have shared hard things. I've told you some vulnerabilities about myself, and you want me to feel better, so you want to hug me, which does not make me feel better, right? That again goes back to you. It's of how you felt about it. So that's important. It's not the intention of the touch, it's the touch that we are concerned with. And so again, you might have great intentions on why you want to touch me, but you please ask first whenever somebody comes from that sort of abuse. And finally, don't do it for them. You teach us how to do it ourselves, right? At some point, you're not going to be in my life, and I need to learn how to do this on my own. The best way you can do that is to hold my hand while I stumble and fall a little bit, and then find my footing, and then you can scoot me on my way, and I can move on to the next thing in my life. Next slide. Here's one of our biggest problems is people hear this and they want to help. They want to jump in and do something. But if you don't understand what this animal looks like, then you're not the right lion tamer, right? You're not the right person for this space. So anybody who wants to be in this space should understand these things. Human trafficking is not like other traumas, including other sexual traumas. The main reason for that is the longevity of it, is because, and the violence that goes along with it. And so there are different things that goes on there, especially when we start talking about people who we should have trusted, people who should have been our safe people. Human trafficking is always a complex trauma. It is never a singular trauma. It is never just one thing. And then often, you've heard me say it before, well-intentioned people will re-traumatize or even re-exploit a person when they're trying to help. And I have seen this in organizations who have the best of intentions, but without understanding all of the complexities of human trafficking, they can end up hurting the very people they're trying to help. Next slide, please. And then here's my confidentiality piece. You never, ever want to share a name, picture, or a story of a minor. It's very simple. They cannot actually consent. It's not their parent's story for their parent to consent to. It is that child's story to own on their own, and they are not in a space yet where they should be consenting to share that. You can never share the name, picture, or story of a person who is in a program. I get a lot of pushback from this from people who run programs, right? Because those are the heartstrings that bring in the funds. And so often you want to share that. You also want to share what you've done well, right? Hey, we've had 58 graduates. That's a good thing to share. Sharing, oh, Susie graduated from our problem and this was her story and here's where she's at. That's not okay. And here's the pushback that I get. We're going to change all the identifiers. I'm on board with that. However, your changing of identifiers should make it so that if you're telling my story, even I don't know it's my story. You should have changed it so much with still my permission. Ask my permission before you do this, right? But you should have changed it so much that even though I know that you interviewed me for this story, when I read it, I go, was that me? That's how much it has to be changed because it's a safety thing again. And then always ask a person before sharing the details of their story with anyone. I told you today that I'm a survivor of trafficking. You can, by all means, go tell people, hey, I heard this lady speak. She identified as a survivor of trafficking. Notice I didn't share any of the details of my story with you because that's for me to decide how and when to share those things. And
I
then,
just want to make it quick. Oh, sorry, Marianne.
yeah, go ahead. No, go.
I was just going to note that I understand that in the education space, you're a mandatory reporter. So Mordecai was
That's
going
not
to.
what we're talking about, though. Yeah.
Yeah,
This is
yeah,
when
yeah.
we're sharing it for other reasons.
Yep, exactly. So I just wanted to make that in case people were like, wait, hold on, how do I do that?
No, I'll gladly talk about that even, because also mandatory reporter. In fact, in some states, anybody over the age of 18 is a mandatory reporter. And so that's a whole different thing. Baby, blab it all, tell it all. You tell their name, their age, their space, you tell all the things because that is a safety thing. You are trying to help a person, but it doesn't mean what you just reported to your abuse hotline or to law enforcement also gets to your friend at the coffee shop. It means you tell it to the law enforcement, the abuse, your supervisor, right? But you don't share that information with other people. Is that better?
Yeah, no, thanks for the clarification. I just wanted to make sure in case anybody was like, wait.
Yeah,
Perfect.
sure.
Thank you.
And then finally, for adults, if you are sharing their story, which really doesn't apply to you all, this is more for organizations, but if you want to have a lived experience of anything person, come to talk to your group, your facility, your fundraiser, you always properly compensate that person for their time and their effort because their experience, their expertise is in their actual history, and that deserves a paycheck at the end. And here you are. If you suspect human trafficking, the one thing that you can do is you can call this number. What this number does is, or text, is it will send it out to your local law enforcement. If you think you see trafficking right in front of your face, please call 911. That is the fastest way to get someone to react. If you see something that looks dangerous immediately, I mean the immediate danger, right? And then also, you can also report it to your local law enforcement agencies. If you just have suspicions of trafficking, it's not a 911 situation. You can also call your local law enforcement agencies as well. And you can see by my disclaimer, it says share all of the details at the bottom. This is where you share all of the details here.
Yeah. So we can go to the next slide. So let's wrap this up. We've got about 16 more minutes. I think we may break even a little bit early, but I want to pay attention before I transition into this next piece to the comments on the side. Again, the chat has been super active. So for those of you who like to participate that way, take a look at what people are posting. I think there's some great possibility for connections between you all. And creating some kind of virtual communities where even if I had a question from somebody in Montana. We've got people from all over the country. Keep this space alive, keep talking with each other, really grow this community. I know Marianne and I both thrilled with the level of attendance. So I'm looking, Judy, I've heard from some of our peeps, it takes one-to-one to 1.5 hours to get a response from the hotline. Yes, that's one of the concerns with the hotline. They had a significant change in leadership a couple of years ago, and they fell down on the job for a little bit. I think that they've been working pretty hard to pull that back. They work closely with a colleague and a friend of ours in Orlando who ends up doing kind of national-based triage, Tomas Lares with United Abolitionists. And so he finds a lot of these connections. I also noted the question, oh, welcome back, Carmen. So I hope you're able to catch the rest of it. But I also wanted to note, somebody mentioned we would like more resources in Montana. Our information, you're welcome to contact us offline and we can talk with you further about those kinds of opportunities. But I know sometimes those states where there are limited resources, it can be really difficult to grow that kind of awareness within a broader community. Also, though we won't be talking about tribal populations and the amount of human trafficking there today, like I said earlier, I think that deserves a special session that focuses on the very unique needs of tribal communities. And we have a colleague that I've worked with who would be somebody I think that we'd like to bring in and work with, given his expertise in working with the Navajo Nation. So let's talk about school communities. That's kind of how this started, was really what's the impact on schools. I'm going to get back to this again later. One of the things that I always do, and Marianne and Mordecai and I all talked about this, we tend to fetishize data. And here's my cautionary tale, and I will revisit this again. When we fetishize data, we oftentimes look at numbers. What are the statistics? What's happening? Well, statistics are differential and used in very subjective ways, right? So there's a labor trafficking video where she reports that 79% of all trafficking cases are labor trafficking. Polaris will not tell you the same thing, nor will the UN. So the numbers are different wherever you go. And that's in part because of the complexity of the crime and identifying traffickers. It's really difficult to do so. And the reticence to identify yourself as somebody who's been trafficked. So that relationship makes for a pretty perfect storm when it comes to having statistical variations, right? You're not going to find that. I think school communities are a place where you're building relationships. I think it's really important to see them as those spaces that, as an educator, as a school professional, I know we have some service professionals as well on the call, but it's not really a call, it's a Zoom meeting, right? It's a webinar, it's not a call. What am I, like 80? I don't know. Anyway, so I think it's really important to think through these systems that you're a part of from where you're located. So we just went into, how do you identify a potential trafficking situation? And as Marianne pointed out, it's often not what you see. You may see nothing. It's what you hear. So we get right back to those rules of good conversation, right? I asked that question because those same rules that people often identify are the very same rules that you apply in any given situation. And then you create a system that cares and hears and understands. So, and that gets right back to humble curiosity. So this is why I say, how can you engage the principles of a good conversation in your conversations with students and colleagues, knowing that students aren't necessarily going to tell you if you don't create the space for them to tell you about themselves. And so how do you do that in your work? So I talked to one person who we were dealing with some pretty significant difficulties in the school system. And one of the things that she did, she's like, students don't feel seen or heard. And it translates, colleagues don't feel seen or heard either. So once a month, her classroom was just a space to talk about your life, because it matters, right? We're not just like, you're not a data point. You're not just a student. You're not just a colleague. You're a person with really complex life situations. And they're really critically important to understand in order to best serve the people that you're working with. Also, when you think of the framing, often we're talking about students, but we're not just talking about students. You don't know what your colleagues are going through oftentimes. So it could be that that person standing next to you has been there or is there now. How are you watching engaging those principles of a good conversation so that you're not creating a space of trauma, so that you're really creating the capacity for them to show you who they are? It's not, you tell me about you. It's, let's open the space and be here together in that place of humble curiosity and deep vulnerability. Schools are really critically important in that conversation. As Marianne said, you may not go to law enforcement. You may not go to a service provider, but you're in school all the time. So what's your space for intervening? How are you going to do that? It's not having, your toolkit that makes everybody kind of the same, or I've got the same traumatic intervention for trauma for this person, this person, this person, this person. It's not a one size fits all. It starts with this very kind of unique relationship that you have the capacity to build with students, with parents, with community members, with your colleagues. And so really thinking through each opportunity, each moment that you meet together is an opportunity to open up the place of understanding. So taking it minute by minute, day by day. But I think it's really critically important to understand you're not vigilante justice, right? You're speaking from inside this. How do I understand this situation? How do I understand this relationally? And that requires that deep listening. So I didn't really have a whole lot for this because I didn't want to go statistical with this and show you like a map of here's what it looks like in school communities. What I do want you to encourage you to do though, start looking into your local space, right? It's not the same resolutions for this in Florida are not going to work in Montana, are not going to work in California. It's very localized and they're not going to work from community to community because all communities look very different. So get to know your community really well. Take that time, get to know where are you seeing vulnerabilities emerge? And then what can you do to help identify that vulnerability and do something about it? How are you going to do that? Because we often talk about downstream approaches. Marianne, you've heard me talk about this way too much, but I always think like if we're going to think through preventions, you have to go upstream, look at the water up there and see what the cesspool is below, right? You're going to see all the things that make the cesspool a cesspool. So how do you really fix that? Now we come back to equity. The same vulnerabilities that you see in communities are also in your school communities. It's important to understand that parity. So if you're seeing things like language barriers are a massive opportunity for people who feel vulnerable, who feel like they can't actually reach out to anybody. You're going to see that in your school communities as well. Oftentimes, if people have parents who are undocumented, right, that's going to be a vulnerability for that person, for that young human or that colleague of yours. So looking at what you're actually facing from where you are in the universe. Michigan isn't going to look the same as Montana. You get the idea. So a lot of this requires some further research. Where do you live? What does your community look like right around you? And how are you putting yourself in places where you're seeing a greater amount of diversity, where you're hearing diverse situations and stories so that you can start to know when the situation is emerging because your ears to the ground now. So it's incredibly important to start from that place of humility, start from a place of curiosity, start from a place of no judgment, and really start thinking through how are you languaging these moments with somebody else? What are the words that you're using? Words matter. Like I always think through the problem of the case management. People aren't cases, right? How do you become a care partner instead of a case manager? That's another big part of it is this requires a partnership. I'm learning as much from you as you might from me. You're helping me as much as I might be able to help you. I don't presume that I can help you until I listen to you first. So I know that this is kind of the more theoretical, but I think that it has a pragmatism to it. Really, yeah. So the care partner, now that you have it, thank you for saying that, Brenda. I appreciate you. I've been making this case for a long time, by the way. It doesn't get a lot of traction because it doesn't get a lot of funding. So like we don't know what you're talking about if you're not saying case management. Well, people aren't cases. And this now requires both of us to care if we have a partnership that's rooted around caring. Yeah, I sit on a board for juvenile justice. They do intervention services with parents and young people. And so I push this all the time. I'm like, I'm your board chair. Listen to me. Care partnership. They're like, yeah, but we still need funding. So I'll get back with you. Our public materials will say that. Our DJJ materials will not. But I think it's incredibly important to show when you're working with somebody who has lived through a human trafficking experience, to show them that you're in humble partnership with them, to prioritize their experience, not your presumed knowledge, and let them unfold that for you. There's no magic to this besides human relationships that are responsive and deeply caring. Nobody has the answer or we'd be done with this. We wouldn't be having this session today, right? So there are multiple questions and multiple answers. Arriving at this community, like I mentioned earlier, I suggested that you engage virtual communities. I think it's really important to open up this conversation across these different barriers and boundaries. And I love seeing that we had such high attendance. So this is a video it's about 16 and a half minutes in length. We've not been successful with the sound, but I think that's okay. I'd like to spend more time on the how do we respond to people who are experiencing or have survived human trafficking. So I mentioned this earlier. One of the things that if you do watch the video, you'll have that content available to you. And it's a good video. And if you look at the title, it's how my immigrant heritage allowed me to ignore labor trafficking. So this speaker is an attorney who focuses now on issues on working with people who've survived or experiencing human trafficking, labor trafficking being her particular interest. In that, one of the things that she talks about that I enjoyed about this was she talks about the fact that she's Indian and had grown up going to India frequently and saw in India, there's a pretty common model for families who have a degree of wealth and they have servants there. And that's the word that she uses. And so what was happening where she was working as a hostess at an Indian restaurant was labor trafficking, but she didn't have the cultural context or lens to understand that that's what was happening. And she tells you about her journey. She does separate labor and sex trafficking to focus specifically, her argument being that we focus so much on sex trafficking, we're not really paying attention to labor trafficking. While that may be true, my concern is that it becomes an either or. And I mentioned earlier, this is not an either or proposition. It should be focusing on all forms of trafficking. That all of that bears our attention and our care. So, and I already went through my cautionary tale of statistics. She will give you a statistic in the beginning that says it's 78%. I was off by a percentage. 78% of trafficking cases are labor trafficking. Again, depending on the source that you're drawing from, you're going to see that statistic changed. Oh, thank you, Jerry. For Zoom, you have to share sound whenever you share videos. We've been struggling with that. So we know we're gonna fight through that, figure it out, and become savvy with this, with the sharing of the sound. But for these purposes, I think it's actually better not to delve into the full video. I'll give you that overview of what her case is, and then understand the vulnerabilities that are relevant to both sex and labor trafficking. So some of those vulnerabilities that she points to, and I kind of developed it a little bit more, but you've got, she notes that a lot of people are trafficked, especially with labor trafficking, outside of their home country. And you might imagine what kind of concerns that would raise at that point, right? If you're in a country with a different language than the one that you speak, or even a different dialect than the one that you're familiar with, you don't even know what your resources are. So if you're in a country where you don't have 911 or a tracking hotline, how would you know to call? Right? So, and then if you have a threatened status with your immigration status, that also leaves you profoundly vulnerable. You're not going to reach out to law enforcement because you may be deported. So now there are some protections for those who are being labor trafficked, but there's still the threat of ICE. So thinking through those kinds of vulnerabilities and those things that hamstring people and don't allow them to actually even grow in their awareness of what they can do for themselves. So I want to note a few things. There are places that oftentimes people don't think of, and I'm sure a lot of people in the room know this, but I made a list: spas, restaurants, massage locations, nail salons. Agricultural labor trafficking happens in farms and groves and ranches. Also landscaping. So a lot of times your large hotel chains are employing people that don't have documented status or are being trafficked. So landscaping, cleaning services at hotels. She notes that men are overrepresented in labor trafficking situations. She gives a statistic there as well. She said 54% of those who are being trafficked for labor are men and 46% are women. Lack of educational resources in communities. So, or poorly funded schools, and that's everywhere in this nation. Gender inequality is a big source for both labor and sex trafficking. So, and understanding too the gendered landscape of trafficking. So, language barriers I just noted. Substance use disorders. Thank you for that reframing of language. Whoever noted that earlier, I appreciate that. Substance use disorders. So mental wellness concerns, if those are present for the individual, then look at the community too. Is there a lack of resources for physical and mental wellness endeavors? I'll point to a localized example. I live in Tampa. I think we covered that earlier. But in Tampa, there's a community called the University Area. And in the University Area, they're starting to kind of really pay attention to that. But historically, you can look at the community and see there's poor infrastructure. They didn't have street lights. there definitely were not mental health resources available to a community that has expressed a need. So those kinds of things set the context for this to happen. And it creates a situation where the person, their vulnerabilities are accessed, they're known, and that's what's used as the mechanism for drawing them in to those situations. So, like I said, this is a very broad overview. I encourage all of you to watch the video with the caveats in mind. You'll come to your own conclusions about the arguments that she makes, but I think that she gives a very nice kind of overview landscape of the issue itself. So with that was a lot of information in a very short amount of time. So I'm going to hand it over to Marianne to pick up with serving survivors of human trafficking. Mordecai, you can shift that slide.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had time to get something to eat and maybe put your feet in the earth for half of a second. I'm a big grounder myself, especially when something is heavy like this, right? And this is a heavy topic, which is why we're giving you the breaks and the time and space that you need to process a lot. Now we're going to go into, okay, you've identified that you're working with survivors of human trafficking. And so how can you do that well? And this presentation was actually created with two friends of mine, Megan Heller, who is a licensed MSW, and Rebecca Whitman, who is also a lived experience expert. Next slide, please. Here is my quick disclaimer, and somebody asked about this earlier. There is a lot of overlap between the dynamics of human trafficking and other abusive dynamics like DV or child abuse, and some similarities in the presentation of those things. However, don't mistake the overlap for uniformity. Okay, just because there are some things that are the same, they cannot be treated the same. Like we said, human trafficking is a whole new animal that we're just now learning what to do with all of the components. And so if your method is ineffective or harmful, your intention means nothing. Again, many people have been harmed in this space by people with good intentions. Next slide, please. We're going to start talking about your perspective. At the beginning of this, Mordecai started us off talking about the language perspective, the perspective you should have coming into the space, how we want to talk to each other. And there's a perspective for people who are in healing. So next slide, please. And that's the strengths-based, right? We want to make sure that we are always looking at what strengths did those people have? We talked about vulnerabilities and how they can also be strengths. And so we're going to help you reframe a few things. Right now, this is how people have traditionally been viewed who have been through human trafficking. They are viewed as hypersexual because it looks like the behaviors that they are committing appear to be hypersexual. But here's how we really want to look at them, is that they're actually over-sexualized. They are acting out a behavior that was put into play a long time before we came into the picture. We also might think that they were prostituting themselves. Often a victim or a survivor will even say, I did this myself, because they don't yet know the correlation between a lot of the things that either happened to them in life or the people who were around them. And so how we want to view them is as being exploited, because even if they put themselves in that place, the people who are purchasing them are not coming into it with the same good faith that maybe that person put themselves out there. They also might be seen, especially with teens, right? Defiant or having bad attitudes. I would go ahead and ask you, what sort of attitude do you think someone should have who's been abused every single day? But what we need to see is that they are so self-protective and strong-willed. That bad attitude might be a survival instinct that kept them safe at some point. They may also be seen as manipulative or attention-seeking. And I always find that to be funny when I hear manipulative being used in terms of a trafficking survivor, because as I work in the business world, that's just called strategy, right? And it's a thing that people use every single day. So we're going to rework that for our survivors as well. They are resourceful and clever and intelligent. That thing that looks like manipulation was another survival skill that got them to the place where you got a chance to meet them. Oftentimes they are thought as untreatable or a lost cause. I once had a family member of a survivor, a teen survivor, say to me, will that person ever be okay? Well, yeah, Yeah, you know, we all have hardships to overcome in life. We've all had stuff happen in our lives that we've had to find new ways in, around, over, through. And so just because someone has been trafficked, it doesn't mean that it's too far gone for them. They will have unique needs and challenges. And we talked about a few of those. And then here's the other thing. They're looked at as fooled or brainwashed. And they might even feel that way themselves. But what we do know is that they are the subject of a highly skilled manipulator with selfish motives. It wasn't on them to be looking out for somebody like that. That was somebody who worked very hard to do exactly what he or she did. Next slide, please. They are also extremely perceptive towards everybody, right? And why is that? Observation of body language is a survival skill. I can keep myself safe if I see what is happening before it ever happens, right? That is something that is a survival skill. That skill does not go away. I have heard a lot of trauma survivors say, I'm so empathic. Well, I would question that and say, or are you just hyper vigilant to some stuff that you grew up with? And now that's just your pattern of behaviors that you see it quicker than a lot of people do. Students or people who have been trafficked can tell if professionals really don't care. This is not the place to just get a paycheck, right? These are human beings, extremely perceptive human beings. And honestly, it doesn't pay that much and the work is really hard, right? And so if you are in this space, you have to be really in this space. That means that we can tell also if you are uncomfortable or nervous or scared. If your dog threw up on the floor this morning, right? We know that these things are happening. And so the best thing you can do is actually speak into that, right? We can tell if you're over your head, if you're lost. I spoke about that counselor who really shouldn't have been in the complex trauma space, right? And we can also tell if you have your own agenda, you know, something like, I want to rescue the people, or I want to save the people, something like that. So how can you combat all of this? The first is you are going to be authentically you. What we can tell, because we are constantly watching to make sure that you are not fake, that you are not going to be yet another person who hurts us. If you are being even a fake persona, I call it your work voice, right? We see right through that and we will not respond. We will shut you down very quickly. So the best thing you can do is be authentically you. I had a client tell me once that I was extremely awkward. I don't disagree with that, but I was being authentically me. And that was something that we were able to open up and have a conversation about then, because I was just being me. Stay non-reactive when they are trying to push your buttons. And everyone who's ever worked with a teenager is saying amen, right? Because that is something they're going to do. Why are they doing that? Well, we want to see if you're going to leave, right? We're testing you to see what you are all about. So you stay non-reactive because it's really not personal, right? It's really not personal. It's a reaction from some trauma that is now coming out on you, and it really has nothing to do with you. It's more about how we are feeling inside. Honesty is good. Admit when you don't know. Like I said about the one counselor, flat out said, oh, this is above my pay grade, right? We're going to find somebody different. Admit when you don't know, or if you mess up, because we are all human. And as survivors are learning to take ownership of a lot of things in life, seeing someone else model this well is helpful for us, that we are able to see, oh, it's okay to say I don't know how to do this, or it's okay to make a mistake and come back from it. And remember this, that with integrity comes vulnerability. And this could be why students or those experiencing human trafficking are struggling, right? We have to model the path. We have to be willing to be vulnerable ourselves. We have to be willing to say, I just don't know, or I'm going to have to go find out for you. And then my favorite, just because you know the lingo doesn't mean you need to use it. That goes back to being authentic. If you try to speak in the way that the person you are talking with speaks, it's going to come off as fake again, and you will get shut down pretty quickly. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about the effects of complex trauma. We did this a little bit on the last one, but we're going to go a little bit deeper this time. Next slide. So Triggers, what are they? You hear it all the time, and we hear it a lot in common culture now that people are triggered by everything, right? We're talking about triggers that are directly related to trauma right now is what we're talking about. So what does it look like? Explicit, the stuff on the outside, right? It's tied to a memory or an image that we can visualize in our mind, that it will come back to our mind. Could also be students or those experiencing HT often recognize that we are triggered, or we might not recognize that we are triggered, right? There are things that can trigger us from outside that maybe aren't as common sense to everybody as I would like them to be. This can be things like songs or phrases or places, a certain part of town, a scent that a person might wear. It can be just a person who looks similar, has a similar walk to someone else. Anything that can be a reminder of that abuse can be a trigger. Anniversaries and holidays are very big also. Anniversaries can be an anniversary of something bad that happened. And so that date prompts up another round of ill feelings when that date is approaching, when we know it's coming. And then especially holidays. We talked about how families are often a part or implicit in trafficking. With the holidays, though, it can be very hard. So if your family has been not healthy, right? Or if you no longer have the family that you thought you were going to go through this earth with, then holidays in general can be hard. And then often holidays can also be tied to even greater instances of trafficking because it provides another avenue of more people to have access to that victim. I like that too. I was kind of reading the notes as people were coming with the other verbiage that they have for the word trigger, because I do think trigger has been overused across the board at this point. So let's talk about some of those implicit activators, if you will. They're tied to a body memory. We talked about how our body is out of whack, how we have to get back in touch with our body, that we're not feeling in our body anymore. So it can be tied to a body memory. We might not even know what that is, right? It could be a simple thing that we don't know what it is. We just feel it when it happens. And the way that you might see it, though, is the reaction to whatever just occurred seems extreme, right? The reaction that you see in me seems extreme for the experience that we both just sat through, right? And so when you see that, that's an indicator that maybe there was something else happening in there. And some examples of that are emotions like shame and fear. Those are things that are brought up. Again, we're talking about people who are victims of things. And so shame is not something that they should have to carry for this, but especially when we're talking about sexual trauma, shame is a very big part of what gets carried along with that. And then also situations can be triggering or activating, things like feeling cornered or a lack of control, right? Being ignored, or even being a part of a family. If you've not ever had that done well, then being in a family can actually stir up a lot of stuff for you. It can be very difficult to work through those feelings when it's not something you've had to navigate before. Next slide. Of course, we know what the trauma reactions are, right? And we could probably spend a whole nother day on just these because they have changed so often throughout the years. And depending on who you talk to, they might have 4, 5, or 6 of these, and maybe even more at this point. So right now, these are the ones we're going to work with today: the fight, flight, freeze, attach, and submit. And we'll go into those a little bit deeper on the next slide. So here, we're going to use me. Here I am, Marianne, and I have now been triggered by something. I've been activated by something that happened in my world. These are the ways that I might respond to those things. And then underneath are the things that you might actually notice in me so that you can tell that something is going on. Under my fight response, I could just be angry, right? I could be angry or aggressive, yelling, screaming, any of those things, whether it's physical or verbal. I could also be very judgmental or critical, almost like I'm gearing up for a fight, right? kind of antagonistic, very controlling. It's very common that when you feel like control is slipping away from you, you want to grab as much of that control as you can. Also not trusting, and we're going to talk more about this a little bit later, but not trusting people is a way of keeping people at arm's length also. Being very guarded is another one of those that goes along with not trusting. Being self-destructive, continuing in patterns of behavior that I have proven to myself are not working, right? Being self-destructive and even being suicidal or suicide ideations. Under flight, right? This is my next one. Under flight, it can look like physical running away, right? It can be, I got up and I took off. It could be that I am seeking distance. Maybe my flight is just into my bedroom, shutting the doors and closing all the blinds, and that's my flight, right? Maybe my flight is through addictive behaviors, and that could be drugs, but there are a lot of things that people can be addictive to that are ways of escaping, of running from whatever is going on. Another way of fleeing is when things get a little too close, when you're building that relationship with me and you're really trying to get to know me so that we can be in that relationship where I can even hear you while you're trying to help me, right? That vulnerability feels scary to me. And so I might end the relationship as soon as it looks like we're getting too close. I might have the desire to die. Notice that's not the same as being suicidal. It means I just don't want to be here anymore, right? And then also being non-committal. And I think that might reverberate a little bit for people dealing with teens, that whole I shut down and I'm really just not talking to you a whole lot. I'm not responding to you. I'm not opening up to you. Under freeze, we have all of our anxieties and phobias. That is a way of freezing us into one spot. Our anxiety or our fears keep us in that spot. Panic, that goes along with the same thing, right? Being ambivalent. It's not that I'm anxious about it. I just don't care anymore, right? I don't care which way we go. And I'm just going to sit here and just let whatever happens, happen. Or I can't make decisions. I'm overwhelmed with the number of decisions. I often say if you are working with survivors of trauma, it's like we're toddlers, y'all. It's like we're toddlers. You give me two choices. Marianne, do you want to wear the red socks or the green socks today, right? Because that's where my brain can handle it. My brain can handle limited options. Overwhelming is too much and I will shut down and freeze on you. Feeling stuck or trapped, right? Whether they are not just the feeling that I cannot escape this. And you've heard people, especially in domestic violence, say that often. I felt like I could not leave. I felt like I could not leave. And then being immobile, that is an actual thing, like agoraphobia, where I am in my house and I really have frozen to the spot. I'm not leaving this spot. I'm not leaving this space. Another way of responding to this is through attachment. Maybe I yearn for even more connection, right? I want somebody to come rescue me. I want somebody to come be my everything. I might fear abandonment. I've probably been left a bit in the past, right? And so I will attach even stronger. This is where that borderline personality disorder comes into play often. This is where that diagnosis usually shows up, is because of our fear of abandonment, we're attaching to everybody. This week I have this girlfriend, next week I have that boyfriend, right? And it's a constant reattaching to people and not always safe people. We can be very eager to please, because if I'm pleasing you, you're not going to leave me or hurt me. But we can also feel very lonely, feeling that even though I might have people around me, I really don't have any real relationship because I'm constantly doing that, attaching quickly to things. It can come off looking very needy or clingy, like I really need a lot of reassurance. I really need you to tell me that you're not leaving, that you're going to stay here. And I might have difficulty establishing healthy boundaries, which is why it's so important for you to be the caretaker of that in this space. While I'm still here, I need somebody to help me establish those boundaries. And finally, with submission. That can stretch from being ashamed. And we already said that shame comes from a lot of sexual trauma. There's a lot of shame attached to that. We might feel depressed, right? That's where I've just given up and given in, that whatever it is. And I don't care attitude. It's going to happen anyhow. So I might as well just let it happen. being very passive and even self-loathing. Like, I don't like me anymore. And also self-sacrificing, going above and beyond and out of my way to try to make somebody think that I am worthy, and feeling helpless an awful lot.
So really quick, Marianne, let's pay attention. I was looking over here. Have you, the word fawning came up, and so I didn't know if you wanted to speak to that really quick as one of
And
the.
yeah, so what happened where this came from, fawn got separated into attach and submit, because what they were saying is that fawn could really be a lot of things, and they broke, and there is a sixth one. I don't recall what that is at this moment, but people have broken these down even further since we did this. But fawn, it was, first we went fight and flight, and then we went fight, flight, freeze, and then we went fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and now here we are. Anything else?
Nope, I think we can keep moving along.
Okay, next slide. And so now we're going to talk about, why did they do that? Like, why did the person who is sitting in front of you do whatever they did? Why are they responding this way? And also some things that you can do that will help you to understand better and even build that relationship better. So next slide. First of all, teens, frequent placement disruptions. When we're talking about kids with those high ACE scores, there is a very good chance they've been in and out of some sort of social services system. And that can also come with frequent placement disruptions. Even in struggling families, they might have to move around a lot, or they might stay with this aunt and uncle one week, with this cousin another week, maybe with grandma and grandpa a different week. And so there can be a lot of movement. Next slide, please. Let's talk about what that cycle looks like of violence. So why are we doing this? There are honeymoon periods, and I hear this a lot from my placement people. When a child first gets there, they are on their best behavior. They are doing such a great job, and you think this is the best kid ever. It can happen in new school settings. They just got there, they're doing their best, but that's back to that control. They're holding on to a lot of control, right? And so we can only hold on to control for so long before it's going to explode. So those honeymoon periods they end because of the fact that it wasn't the true authentic person. There are a lot of night to nights. If I don't know where I'm sleeping from this night to the next night, then it's very hard for me to worry about things like whether I'm being polite to you or not, or whether I should be listening in school or not. There's a lot of other stuff going on. There are a lot of reasons why a person can't stay in a place that they're living. Some of that is violence, threats, destruction of property, especially when they're in group homes or the foster care system, right? They might be running away. There might be recruitment. We talked a lot about that. That also happens at the teen level, where the local recruitment is happening in the social service system. There might be inappropriate sexual behavior where they cannot stay in the place that they are in anymore. Because remember, they are over-sexualized due to the history that they have. And so that can be coming out in the actions that they have now. They also might have suicidal threats or be self-harming. This becomes difficult in group settings because it becomes a trend. When one person self-harms, it's like a cycle, and then the next, and then the next, and it becomes a thing. Self-harming is not the evil that a lot of people have brought it out to be. It is a coping skill. It's not a good coping skill, right? It's a maladaptive coping skill, but it's still a coping skill that that person is using. And they're telling you, hey, something hurts really bad inside. This is the only way I'm getting it out. But in group settings, it becomes a problem, because then it makes its way around the entire group. And then you have this plethora of people who are all self-harming. And persistent insubordination. I actually hear this from parents a lot, that they cannot get the kid to listen. They cannot get the kid to behave, and they just don't know what else to do at this point. And then they start looking at other programs to help them because they don't know what to do with that. This pattern can continue well after the youth ages out, right? The problem is that all of these things that are happening when they're 12, 13, 14, 15, again, they don't stop just because they turn 18. So the kids who are going through all this, and these are the behaviors we're seeing, become the adults with the exact same set of behaviors. And again, much higher consequences once they are adults and these behaviors are coming out. And then over here on the other side, what you see is the cycle of violence, which I'm sure you're all aware of. But if all abusers were just evil and mean, we would spot them so much easier, wouldn't we? But unfortunately, they're not, because they use that. They use that to keep people sucked in and stuck in a pattern by mixing up the violence with kindness and some peace and being their protector, and then dropping it all on the head again. Next slide, please. Oftentimes what happens with kids especially, right, but people exiting their life, is we're not even aware of what appropriate behavior is. If I grew up in abuse and crime and drugs, my idea of appropriate behavior might be different than yours, right? So let's talk about that. Next slide. Some of those examples: invasive questions, right? Honest but rude comments. They might ask you very personal things about your life that in any other setting, you'd be like, why is this person asking this? But it's because there has not been that boundary before. That has not been a boundary. Or honest comments. I had a client tell me that I smelled like my dog every single day. Maybe I do. I don't know, right? But it's that type of thing that you just don't know. There are things that they're just telling you, and maybe that person was trying to help me. Maybe I really did smell like my dog and they were trying to help me, but there might have been a nicer way to say that, right? Not understanding privacy. If you've never had privacy, you don't even know what that means. Or I might think that my privacy is very important, but yours is not so much, right there. I don't want you to ask invasive questions of me, but I feel entitled to get that same information out of you. Inappropriate attire in public. Even though I helped write this, I still struggle with that line, because who am I to tell you what is appropriate in public, right? I think that we can say we don't want to do things that would hurt people, right? That would be distracting to hurt us, another human being. But we can agree that in professional settings, there are ways to dress. In school settings, there are ways to dress, right? There's a whole school code that tells you how you could dress in your school. I'm sure wherever you work has a code that says this is how we dress when we come to work. And those are the kinds of things that people exiting trafficking might not understand, just because it's not been a thing before, right? There is not any sort of code of how we should dress out in the streets. And so we might not yet understand that that changes when I enter a new arena. And I might not know the difference between personal and professional. Again, that's going to go back to those invasive things, right? I might not know where there should be a boundary. Maybe I'm working my first real job, but I don't recognize that at this job, that's not the kind of stuff we're going to talk about here. And even if you're my teacher or you're my friend or my counselor, or I might say things to you that are even too far for our relationship, and it might be up to you to help me hold that boundary. So what can you do for that? Oops, can you go back one? Never assume that we are knowingly doing something inappropriate, okay? Don't think, oh, there's Marianne again, just showing herself again, just out there doing it, right? That's not what it is. I might not know any different. No one has ever told me, hey, Marianne, there's a different way of doing this. And let's talk about what some of those options are. Non-judgmentally explain the effect of the behavior on me and on people around me. Hey, Marianne, if you dress that way, you might not get that job going into that interview. If you want them to hire you, here are some things that you could wear that would also make you still feel like you and feel empowered and feel like you're your own person, but also will put out the right impression that you're trying to put out in order to get that job. And just kind of explain it very matter-of-factly. Marianne, if you want people to think a certain way about you, then you can't go screaming the F word at them. They're not going to respond to you well when you're telling them to go F themselves, right? Those are the kinds of things that we might need some help understanding. And then kindly educate us on appropriate behavior and boundaries, teaching us how we can start to do that for ourselves. Next slide. And I alluded to this before too, there are basic life skills that either I was not taught or maybe somebody tried really hard, but while I was in survival mode, I couldn't hear any of that. So let's talk about what that looks like. Next slide. In life, right? I might not have basic hygiene or health. I already said, maybe I never have gone to a doctor. Maybe that hasn't been something that anyone's ever told me. I might have a lot of sexual knowledge, but not a lot of knowledge about my own body. I might not even understand things like menstruation or birth control or how even pregnancy really works. A lot of things that, based on my history, you would assume that I know. Please don't assume that I know those things. Money management and budgeting, I cannot stress this enough. This is one of the #1 problems we have. And it comes back to either we never had money to manage, right? Or it was never an option for us. No one ever helped us with that. Ordering food, knowing our likes and dislikes. If a trafficker has always told me what I was going to eat, if an abuser has always just said, this is what you will eat, I might not know if I like it or if I don't like it. And so I don't know how to do that. But that also goes back to the ordering food, the overwhelming. Grocery stores can be very overwhelming. So if I'm trying to teach a survivor how to budget and go grocery shopping, maybe walking into the supermarket isn't the best idea. Maybe learning how to do it online first, where I'm not overwhelmed with, you guys know you walk down an aisle and it's all of the things. Or trying something that doesn't have quite so many options, like an Aldi or something like that, that'll be a little less overwhelming for us as we're learning. We might not know how to shop for clothes or groceries or any of that. We might not know reading a food label to understand, what am I putting into my body? How is it going to affect me? How's that going to affect my overall mood and my health? And then also knowing our personal information. If someone has already taken all of our stuff, of course, I'm not going to know that. Or maybe I never had a chance to get it. Maybe I never had a chance to get those things, but especially diagnoses. And when we go into doctors' offices, what's one of the first things they ask you? Are there any examples in your history? Does your mom, does your dad have these disorders? Does your grandma, did your Uncle Joe, whatever it is? And for a lot of people like me, we don't have that information. We don't know any of that information. And it becomes another source of shame for us when we're sitting in a doctor's office and we can't answer what seems to be very simple questions because it's something we never had the opportunity of learning. Some examples in services. I might not know how to keep appointments on a calendar. Or I might write all my appointments down on different Post-it notes all over the place, but then I have no idea where those Post-it notes went. You might even help me write it down. You might give me a business card to help me write it down, but it's not translating into my day-to-day life. Calling and setting appointments and leaving voicemails. If I could explain to you the sheer panic that happens in so many survivors when they have to make a phone call, it's a very common thing that we talk about. Making that phone call is hard. There are a lot of unknowns on the other end of that phone call. And so picking up the phone to make that phone call is very hard. And then as soon as you start asking us a question we can't answer, we're done. We just hang up the phone and we're over it. And so the best thing you can do there, hold our hand, walk us through it. Don't hand us a list of phone numbers and say, go call one of these resources, because the chances are we're not calling any of those resources. You've given us too much. I'm overwhelmed by the complexity of the numbers that you gave me. And now I'm not calling anybody. So the best thing you can do is to sit with us and walk us through that as we're learning. And we don't always tell you if we're going to cancel. We're very good at no showing, right? And that's not the way to do business. That's not the way that this world works. That's a good way to lose a job, right? And so we might have to learn, hey, you have to call people. You have to let them know if you're not going to make it, that is the polite thing to do. And that makes it so they can trust you later on. We might not know how to sign forms electronically and get them back to you. I would venture to say a lot of people in business are still struggling with this too, right? But if I haven't had access to a lot of things, I might need somebody to teach me those things. And then finally, we'll talk about future planning and identifying goals. It was back in the day, we were talking about our prefrontal cortex didn't develop until we were 25, and now we're saying even closer to 30. That's where all my planning comes from. So if my prefrontal cortex hasn't developed enough for me to plan well, then that means somebody's supposed to hold my hand while I'm doing all of this planning. If I don't have those safe people, I don't have safe parents, I don't have that around me, there's nobody teaching me to do that well. And so that's not a skill that I'm learning. And so even in my own life, if you ask me what my plan was at any given time, it was a very loosely defined plan because that's the best that I could absolutely do. One of the things that we're very good at is self-sabotage, and that comes up over and over in our life. And a lot of it comes from fear. So let's talk about that. Some examples are asking for services and then not showing up, or saying that I want help with something and then not following through on whatever it was that I said I would do. I might disappear from or damage relationships with healthy people, right? As soon as you start to get a little close and we're starting to get somewhere, and I'm going to frustrate you a lot because I'm going to dip out and run away and not call you, right? Because I'm getting to the close. It's building up inside of me. I can feel it all building up, and it's scary, right? It's scary to heal, and it hurts to heal. And so when something starts to look like it's going to be too good to be true, I might do something to damage that so that I don't have to worry about you leaving me because I've already shut it down first. We might deliberately disobey placement rules knowing we will get kicked out. We also do this a lot. We'll make some progress and then we go backwards, and it feels like we did 1 step forward and 3 steps backwards and 4 steps to the side, right? It's a lot of growth is not linear. And so it's a constant giving and taking and moving and shifting and being willing to be in that space. So what can you do? You are to remain patient and consistent. Consistency is the key, because I'm going to be this flaky person, right? That's what I know. I am following my patterns of survival. I need you to be consistent. I need to know that even if I run, you're going to be there when I come back. And that doesn't mean that there aren't rules and boundaries, and we'll talk about that. But you are going to consistently be who you are so that I don't have to question you. You're going to be self-aware when you're becoming frustrated with me, right? You have to change your expectations or your boundaries to work with me, because I can't change my expectations yet, right? I'm not there yet. So if you're expecting too much out of me, that's something you have to think about. I'm not there yet. Discuss it with your team, right? Make a plan on how to address it with the student, because if you're feeling frustrated, chances are your colleagues are also feeling frustrated. Chances are I'm not taxing just your nerves, right? So talk to the people on your team, form a plan so that you can stay a united front in working with the individual. And then evaluate whether your services are enabling or whether they are really hurting somebody else, because stopping services sometimes is necessary, but should always be a group decision. And if your services are enabling, we don't want that, right? Because that's not going to help somebody be self-sufficient later. Next slide, please. And now we're going to talk about some of the behaviors that you might see too. So why did they do that? Students or whomever you're seeing, right? It seems like they're making no progress at all. I'm going to challenge you. What does progress look like, right? If I were to ask you, how do you know if someone's making progress? Let's talk about that. Next slide. We already said that probably a trafficker has been preying on their basic needs. So what is progress? If you are asking them to be up there in that yellow range, that's not where we are yet. We got to start at the bottom, right? And so progress might be, hey, I did manage to find my own food for a week. That could be progress. Hey, I did manage to find a place to sleep where I was safe. That's progress. Hey, I actually took time to rest instead of going to try to outrun all the trauma and voices in my head. That's progress. And so understanding what progress looks like, because we can't go any further if we haven't built that foundation yet. If I don't have the foundation of my basic needs, my food, water, shelter, clothing, right? then safety isn't even a concern yet. Because while I'm hungry, you can do anything to me to get me some food, right? You can exploit me while I'm hungry. So we have to start with the basic needs. Those have to be met first. And then we start talking about safety and security. And then notice we start talking about how well I can relate to other people. But we have a lot to get through before we get to me relating to people better. Next slide, please. Students or people who are experiencing human trafficking may have an unusually strong attachment to a phone or something else, right? Part of that could be something that a trafficker instilled in them that you don't leave without this, but it could be something different. Let's talk about that too. Next slide, please. They might be very attached to any sort of material item, their phone, their headphones, music, whatever, backpacks. We have to figure out what that is. What does that represent to the person? Because if it represents something to the person, it makes more sense why they don't want to give it up. And sometimes they have to. They're sitting in a classroom. They're not supposed to have their phone out. They're not supposed to have headphones on. You're supposed to take it till the end of the hour, whatever that is, right? It might be a real thing, but they lose it. They go off the chain and they're screaming, yelling, cursing you, and all of the things. What does that phone represent? What does that stuff represent? It might be a symbol of something much bigger to them. Things like their safe spaces, if they have their own room, if they have a space to go and be in their own person, if you take that away from them, they don't have anything anymore. And especially when somebody has to share a lot of spaces, just having one little corner that you can kind of make your own can really do a world of good for a person who feels that they're constantly overwhelmed with all of the things. The items could be connected to a loved one or with sentimental value, right? It could also be, I didn't say this before, it could also be a coping mechanism. Maybe my headphones are on and my music is on because it helps me to dissociate just enough where I can still do my homework, but I don't have to have the intrusive thoughts in my head. And that could be a very real thing too. It could be an actual coping mechanism. So what can you do? Understand that whatever that thing is, it represents something to them. It might be their security, their stability, their family. And so that is why the reaction that you're seeing seems so extreme. Be empathetic without bending boundaries unnecessarily. There are times when you can look at a boundary and say, this feels like it would work better right now if I gave a little bit and we met in the middle. This might be the right time for me to tell you, you know what? Go ahead and keep that phone in this instance because it feels like it's going to help you more than it's hurting you. That could be a real thing. But if it's an actual boundary where you cannot do that, then you hold your boundary and you say, I understand that you don't want to give this to me, but this is the rule and we have to follow the rule because the rule keeps everybody safe. Don't try to reason when they're escalated. People cannot hear you when they're up here, right? And so that goes back to the breathing. People will model what you do. If you are taking slow, controlled breaths, they will also begin to take slow, controlled breaths. If you are speaking in a calm and neutral tone, that will help them to start to come back down again. Even lower your tone a little bit so that they have to lower their tone a little bit to be in the same space with you. So you don't want to reason while they're still escalated. There's plenty of time for explanation later. Always offer alternatives or compromise when it's possible. Like I said, hey, it looks like this phone is really something you need right now. This one time I can let you have it, but only if you sit in that corner over there so it's not disrupting other people, right? That would be something that maybe could be done sometimes. Next slide, please. Students or those who have been trafficked may talk about being pregnant or wanting to be pregnant. And I told you we'd be getting back to this. So next slide, let's talk about what this is about. Can be very simple. It can be just that need for family or that unconditional love. I don't feel loved in my life. I want something. Oh, please hold. Let me get rid. I have a garbage truck going by right now, which is upsetting my dog very much. It can be that they want something to love them, right? We think that if I have a child, then that child will love me forever. And so we think that if I had my own baby, then I would be creating that family. Maybe my family's not so good, but I could create my own family. Also, being nurtured and cared for. We all love pregnant people. Everybody asks questions. Do you know the gender? When's your due date? You know, what's your color scheme? All these questions, right? And so it's that feeling of being loved and cared for and wanted. Falsified pregnancies can and will happen. Please consider whether they even know how pregnancy happens. I have heard teenagers think that just because they had sex one day, that they would know that they were pregnant the next day and say, I'm pregnant because I had sex last night. And we all know that that's not exactly how it happens. So they might not even understand how it works. They might not be intentionally falsifying pregnancies. They might not really understand how it works. Consider their intellectual ability. We talked about that. People who are coming to us from other populations that are even more vulnerable. Maybe they really don't understand how this works, but also that can just be an age thing. And then consider what need or desire a pregnancy would fill. Why would they be saying this? Why would they be making this up? If they're telling you they're pregnant every single month, what is the reason behind that? What is going on that would make them think that having a child would be a good thing? So what could you do? When appropriate, right? Because it's not always your role, educate the students that this is a common control tactic by abusive partners. So this is something an abusive person might actually be trying to get them pregnant because it is another control tactic. Stay non-reactive. No matter the age, no matter the intellectual ability of the person, stay non-reactive. Something that doesn't happen a lot, especially for trafficking survivors. When we do say we're pregnant, we don't hear the words congratulations a lot, right? And so if your first reaction to a 13-year-old who might be a trafficking survivor saying that she is pregnant, if your first reaction is, oh my gosh, what are you going to do? And how are you going to do this? And you don't have a job and all of that stuff. That's not helping in this situation. We're already here, right? And so that's not a helpful reaction. Don't instruct them on what choices to make or not make. Respect their own self-autonomy. Because here's the thing, you might not be the best person to have this conversation. It might be out of the realm of what you should do based on your relationship, but it also might not be your role based on your own personal beliefs and biases, right? It might be something that hits a little too close to home for you to stay non-reactive and stay in that space where you can actually help. So maybe you should see, is there somebody else that that person can talk to about this situation that could maybe handle it in a different way than you would? Next slide, please. Students or those experiencing human trafficking disappear or just ghost professionals for a while, even though they seem to be engaged before that happened. So next slide. Some of the reasons for that is they just have chaotic lives, right? If you're in the middle of abuse, it's very hard to remember, oh, I was supposed to go meet, Susie at 2:00 on Tuesday. They might actually also be in the middle of a crisis. Maybe they are incarcerated. Maybe they are on the run right now. Maybe there is something else going on. And so life itself, life itself might be what is getting in the way. It could go back to they're testing you, right? They want to know if you're going to abandon them. And just like we said before on self-sabotage, if I already think that I can't trust you, I'm just going to go ahead and leave now. I'm going to put it on me so I get to choose how we leave. They might feel too seen. This is really when you're doing your job well. You're building that relationship and it starts to boil it up inside of them because we feel too seen. You now know too much of me and I'm uncomfortable with that. And it's easier for me to just disappear than to stay in this space of vulnerability with you. Services might not be a priority. Maybe I am a single teen mom and maybe I am trying to work 2 jobs and finish my GED. Maybe I am doing a lot already and this just isn't the time that I want to devote on this. And it's nothing personal. It's just not where I want to be right now. And then back to that self-sabotage. I'm going to leave you before you have a chance to leave me. So what can you do? Don't get angry, because it is never personal. Even when it sounds personal, even when it feels personal, it is never personal. So anger isn't going to help you at all. Check in regularly a few times and then place the ball back in my court. You call me up. Hey, Marianne, we had an appointment for Tuesday at 2 and you didn't show up. And I was really looking forward to our appointment. You know, what happened there? Hey, Marianne, you missed a second Tuesday. Now, you know that we have an agreement that if you miss 3 Tuesdays in a row, you're going to lose that time slot. And I know you really like that time slot because it worked with your work schedule. So can you give me a call back? Can we talk about this? Do we need to find you a different time slot? Hey, Marianne, this is the 3rd Tuesday. And like I said, you know, I can't hold this time slot open for you any longer. If something changes and you would like to come back, by all means, give me a call and we'll see what we can do then. But I'm going to go ahead and give you the space that you're requesting right now. And you let me know when you want to pick this back up again. And then you can expect that they will likely return, especially if you have made them feel safe. It might take a year, it might take more, but they will come back when they are ready if you have been that person for them and they are able to. And don't always assume the worst, right? Like they're back in the life, they're back on the drugs, they're back in whatever. Don't always assume the worst. There are times for you to investigate that further, right? If they are disappearing on you and there are other things going on, you might need to investigate that further. Again, that goes back to that mandatory reporting, but you don't automatically assume that the worst thing has happened. Next slide, please. They may become uninterested in talking to service providers, teachers, or whatever, but they also don't want you to leave. They don't want to tell you anything. They don't want you to actually be able to do your job, but they also don't want you to go away either. They still want you in their life. So what does that look like? Let's check that out on the next slide. First of all, they might be testing their ability to trust you, right? Are you going to stay? If I push back a little bit, are you still going to be here? Are you able to handle my feelings and my challenges? Really, are you going to be the person that's going to stand beside me, or are you going to be the person who buckles as soon as things get hard? They also might want to test your reactions, right? To see what you're going to do. Are you going to all of a sudden make it about you? Are you going to flip the script on me? So I want to see what type of temperament you have, and I'm going to test that for you. And then just like a lot of children, right? I just want to see what I can get away with. It's not personal. I'm not mad. I might even think it's funny a little bit, but I'm going to push at you so that I can really test you and see what you're made of. So what can you do? Same thing. You stay consistent. You stay consistent to what you know to be true, because my reality is going to shift and change a lot. My behaviors are going to shift and change a lot. You stay consistent. Communicate the boundaries with me clearly so that I'm well aware that there's not a communication problem, and respectfully so that I know what you expect from me, but I also know what you can expect or what I can expect from you. I need to know that it's a two-way street. And so telling me that out, putting that in writing helps out a lot. You're going to remain calm and non-reactive as you enforce those boundaries. Gee, Marianne, I'm really sorry, but you missed 3 Tuesdays. And I thought we were getting somewhere. We were doing some good work here, but also we have a boundary. And so to be fair to everyone, if somebody misses 3 appointments, I have to give that slot to another person who can be more attentive. And then balancing firmness and flexibility in a reasonable manner and teach them why, because none of this is black and white, right? There is so much gray area. So you have to be in that flexible space. Heather, did you want to take a short break? I briefly saw that pop up.
Yeah, we had it scheduled, but I think that rather than break up your presentation, maybe we can do that between your presentation and the pointing toward healing center here. It's running pretty smoothly, and I think that people are probably enjoying it. Yeah.
Okay. So students, Also might no-show appointments rather than canceling, and they don't say why. And that can be very frustrating, right? As a service provider, that can be very frustrating, but they don't say why. Let's talk about it. Next slide, please. It could be that they have a really good relationship with you and they don't want to disappoint you. Like I said, that phone call is really hard. If I call you and I tell you I'm not coming, I'm going to disappoint you and you're going to ask me questions that I might not have the answers to, or I might have the answers, but it's not a really good answer. Hi, Marianne, why can't you come to this week's appointment? Well, it's a beautiful sunny day and I want to go to the beach, right? So it might be that I don't want to disappoint you and not anything devious. I fear that if I say no to you, I'll lose the relationship, right? So I fear that if I call you up and I say, hey, I'm not going to make it, then you're going to say, well, you can't do this at all. I don't work this way. We can't do this. And so it's easier for me to just disappear than say no and then have you disappear. Boundary setting is a learned skill. Is it something I've learned yet? That's something you have to determine first. Is that something I'm good at, or is that something I'm still learning? What can you do? You can provide options, but still set boundaries. Tuesday's not working for you, Marianne. What day works better for you? Oh, you can't come because you lost your transportation. Can we switch this to a Zoom meeting? Something like that. Where can we find a common ground? Give us a space to change our mind and then check in about this. Hey, Marianne, you said you didn't want to continue services anymore. I'm just checking in with you. It's been a couple weeks. I wanted to see how everything is going in your life. See if you're happy with that decision. Is that something you want to continue with? Great, thanks. It's been great talking to you again, right? It's really easy to check in. Empower them to say no and voice their discomfort and concerns. It could be, I've never learned how to say no well before. I've never been allowed to say no before, right? No always came with consequences. And so helping me to learn to say no and say, I don't like how this is going. I don't like how this works. This doesn't work for me any longer, is teaching me a skill that I need for future jobs and future relationships. And so that can be a really good thing that you can help us with. And then paying attention to our nonverbal communication. This is where I'm going to tell you to start paying attention to those other things. Don't assume the worst, but am I doing a lot? Is there something else that's going on in my life that you are watching that, combined with me not showing up to the appointments, you're saying, I think there is something else there, and maybe we need to discuss this as a team or even take this further. Maybe there's something else that we need to report to somebody here, depending on what space that person was in. Next slide, please. Students or those experiencing trafficking also can move between different forms of exploitation. And this goes back to that labor and sex correlation also, that it's never just one thing, right? And so once we've been abused in one way, we are more susceptible to abuse in other ways. So next slide, please. Some of the possible explanations is we're gaining more exposure to more methods of exploitation, right? There's more out there that we're learning about. When we start talking about those things like group homes and stuff like that, we're getting an education that we really didn't need or deserve. And so we can learn even more ways to get harmed. We might think that controlling our own exploitation, this can be survival sex or even people in the field of prostitution, is a stepping stone to exiting the life fully. That I think that if I don't have someone controlling my actions and I start taking control of my actions, then that's almost like being out of the life. That's one step closer to nobody abusing me. Some forms of exploitation have a higher level of physical safety. I might feel more comfortable in certain spaces. I might feel more safe with certain traffickers, right? There might be certain places that even if you looked at them, you said, oh, those are not good. In my world, it's safer than whatever I just came from. And we have a saying in the life that the hell you know is better than the hell you don't know. And so if I feel like I can take a step up, and even though it's bad, it's not that bad, that might be what I do. Environmental factors, that financial comes back really quick. Our basic needs come back really quick. If I don't have a place to sleep and I don't have food in my belly and I don't have a roof over my head, I am very vulnerable to someone who will provide me one or more of those things in order to keep me safe or to keep me in the space that they want me to be in. Sorry. Sometimes not recognizing the different avenues trafficking can take, right? If all I've known is one type of abuse, let's say it started with my family. Well, when it's my significant other doing it, it seems like it's a whole different thing. I was mad when it was my parents, but now that it's my significant other, it seems really different. I might not notice that it's the same thing. So what can you do? You educate when appropriate, right? We never want to force somebody into a title that they didn't want or into a label that they didn't want. And so we want to educate about what the facts are, what it looks like, without ever trying to get somebody to own a label, right? We focus on safety, not morality, because it's not about morality. It is about safety. Are you safe in this space? What space would make you safer? Harm reduction safety planning. We do this a lot in the world of addictions as well. Harm reduction. If I can get you to try a little bit more in this area, it's better than what it was yesterday, right? And you baby step your way back to safety. We assess for potential financial strains and address them early because we know that that is going to be one of those precursors to shove somebody back into the life. So we want to know, do you know how to budget? Do you already feel pressure? Is there something going on that's adding to that pressure? And are there methods to help you deal with that already? There might be services in place already that can help, but unless someone helps us and educates us on what those might be, we might not know to ask. Next slide, please. This is the one that I think bothers people the most is you see us jump from one trafficker to another or abusive boyfriend or girlfriend to another and so on. We're constantly in these relationships that you're looking at and you're shaking your head and saying, what are they doing over there, right? Next slide, please. This goes back to the hell I know, right? My new partner might be better than the last one. This one might be safer. That last one punched me every day. This one doesn't. That's a safer option for me. Abusive people find vulnerable targets. I've already been abused. I am already vulnerable for those same types of abuse and others. So if I'm already more vulnerable, this is what I like to say, those abusive people smell it on us. They can sense, just like I am hypervigilant to the people who are coming at me to hurt me, they are hypervigilant to the people who they can hurt. And so they are on the lookout for somebody with those multiple vulnerabilities so that they can come back and re-exploit us. And I just saw somebody said, and we look for new trauma bonds. That is something that it is known to our physical being how to connect in that way. And so we look for that same connection because that's felt normal to us our whole life, right? And we might think that that jealousy and that violence is protective, right? Not controlling. Look how much he loves me. He cares about me so much that he's crazy about me, right? We've heard people say that. It looks like that means that they care about us. And if we grew up in that type of abuse, then we don't know that that's not what true love looks like. And that's what I just said. If toxic relationships are all we know, then that's what we know. I don't know that there is another thing out there. And until I have seen it from somebody else, I might not know that it even exists. So what can you do? Be understanding of the internal struggle between our true desire to change and our fear of it. Just because I'm not changing on your timeline doesn't mean I don't want to. It doesn't mean I'm not trying. I am trying my hardest, but I'm also scared and running back to what I know and self-sabotaging all at the same time, right? Be patient. You have to meet us where we are. You have to lose your own agenda because whatever you want me to look like in 5 years, maybe that'll be and maybe it won't be. But if that's not my agenda, it doesn't really matter, right? I have to learn how to be autonomous and develop my own sense of self and learn who I am. I might not know who I am. So I need you to just meet me where I am and learn who I am with me as I'm learning. Set reasonable and realistic expectations. You can't ask me to fly if I haven't even jumped, right? So I have to learn baby steps. I have to start at the beginning, wherever I am, and move forward from there. And again, non-judgmental. And that means even when you have a really good relationship, you don't want to speak too freely. Again, that's a boundary, right? We want to make sure that we know that we aren't crossing a boundary because we have a good relationship with this person. And understanding that the complex nature of what the abuser does to manipulate and control, right? It's so hard for us to see that someone who we thought we could trust, who we thought was a safe person, who we thought had our best interests at heart, even if they were doing horrible stuff at the same time, we believed what was going on was an actual relationship. It's hard for other people to understand that when they have not yet been through it. And so for you to understand that it is a complex nature of that relationship, and we can't explain it any better than it looks to you on the outside. It's something that we do have to learn to work through ourselves in understanding what's inside of us and how we're reacting to other people and how we keep ourselves safe from those vulnerabilities. Next slide. And now here we're going to talk about what happens with us, right? So some of us may be very distrustful, right? We have our guards up 24/7. You couldn't get in. We've got walls up and we've got snipers on the walls and a moat around the walls. You could not get in to us. And then others of us are going to just tell you everything. I'm going to tell you everything that happened to me from the day I was born until right now, right? I'm going to tell you every bit of it, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of it, right? And you've seen both of those. So let's talk about that. Next slide, please. The overly guarded. They are highly self-protective. This is what has done them well in their survival is, I'm not going to give away anything. I'm going to keep it all very close to myself. And it's usually because their trust has been broken too many times. They're not going to let that happen anymore. If you have a client or a student like that, it can take months to establish rapport to get them to open up. It's not going to come easy. A lot has built up that wall, so it takes a lot to break it back down. And you do that by just showing up, by being consistent, by being who you are, by always showing up and being non-judgmental. For the other extreme, the not guarded enough, it's also highly attachment oriented, right? Also self-protective. It's because I want you to like me. I want you to know everything about me right now so that we can be friends. And I've found that if I tell you everything, you might want to be my friend. It can be secondary to feeling unprotected often, that I feel like this actually protects me by blurting it all out. There's some safety there in that it's already out there. I may overshare and lack boundaries, which is why I need you to have good boundaries. And then you need to teach and enforce boundaries without making me feel judged for not knowing. It's a very simple, Marianne, I'm really glad you wanted to share that with me, but this might not be the time or the space, or I might not be the right person for you to share that with. Let me get you in contact with somebody that could share, that you could speak with better than I am. And next slide. Oh, yeah.
Next one, I just wanted to point to, Alicia's been posting some great information. The Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. If people have those kinds of resources that they want to post in the chat, don't hesitate to. Also, I like your comment very much. Can end up with what I call a vulnerability hangover after oversharing and then withdrawing from building relationships. It's a great comment.
Oh, yeah, I like that. Most of us, though, are going to be somewhere in the middle. You'll see the highly guarded and you'll see the ones that are really not guarded at all, right? But most people are going to fall somewhere in the middle. And this can be even more confusing for people who didn't go through the same things or similar types of abuses. It can look like this. I don't trust a daycare, right? Because I don't know those people, but I will leave my kids with my new boyfriend who I just met 2 weeks ago, right? Why am I doing that? Goes back to the hell I know is better than the hell I don't know. But I also might be afraid of the system, right? If I take my kid to daycare and there's a scratch on my kid, you might call the abuse hotline and now I'm in trouble. Whereas my boyfriend's not going to call the abuse hotline, right? He's not going to make that phone call. So it's safer there. I might feel confident in my ability to screen people. well, gee, I've been in danger my whole life, and I'm really good at picking out who the dangerous people are and who isn't. And so if somebody was really dangerous, I would know, because my feelers, my antenna are so much stronger than everybody else's, right? Also, safety might mean something different. Danger is relative. Your idea of what is unsafe might be vastly different from my idea of unsafe. And my idea of safety was rooted in abuse. And so it might be really, really different from what you think. And I also think that I have the greater ability to protect myself or my child than a professional would. I don't trust you. I've seen that the system is untrustworthy. I'm going to trust me over anybody else. I'm going to trust my own feelings, my own gut instinct over anybody else. I might also have a hard time trusting professionals, but again, I'll trust strangers, right? I'll trust that person I just met down the road, but I'm not going to trust you sitting in the office with all of your fancy degrees on the wall. The reason is you don't understand that. You haven't lived that life. You haven't come from that same situation. But the people who are around me in my community, they do. They've lived it with me. They understand it. I trust them because even if I can't trust them, I think I know the areas that I can't trust them, right? I think that there's a difference there. I trust them here, but not there. It might be the mutual hardship and the trauma that establishes that level of trust, right? We have so much in common. Obviously, we're the same, and I trust me, so I would trust you. And it's also what meets the need, because that community, that unsafe community, might be filling a lot of needs that you can't and shouldn't, right? Because it's not your role in my life. Your role is as a professional. So you're not going to give me love and affection and belonging and safety and family. So I'm going to trust that person who is giving me all those things, even though everything they're doing is mimicking the abusive things that I've seen in the past. They may manipulate, skew, or withhold information, even when it's not necessary, right? So not necessary. Shock value comments. We talked about this a little bit before. They just want to see what you're going to do. They're going to drop something on you just to see what you're going to do. I also might tell you I'm doing better than I really am, right? I might tell you, oh yeah, I'm doing great in school. I'm doing great. Yeah, I'm not talking to that boy anymore. I met a nice person over here and I'm not doing any of that stuff anymore. Why do I do that? I don't want to disappoint you, right? I want you to think I'm doing a good job. I want you to say nice things to me too. And if I tell you that I'm struggling, you might not say those nice things. I don't want accountability. I'm just learning about accountability and it's not feeling too good, right? I don't want that accountability. And I know if I tell you the truth about everything, there might be something that you have to say about that. I also might want praise or approval or belonging. I want to tell you how great I'm doing so that you'll tell me what a great person I am and how proud you are of me. I also might exaggerate the details of the situation while omitting my part, right? So yeah, there was a fight in school today and you would be so proud of me, miss, because you know what? I didn't even get involved in that fight. Those two girls, they started fighting and I saw it and I just stood off to the side and I minded my own business and I didn't stay out of it. And while you're telling me what a great job I did, Marianne, I'm so proud of you. Normally you would have jumped into that fight and that was your friend. And I'm really proud of you for not getting into trouble yourself. But the part that I forgot to tell you is that the whole reason the fight started is because I went up to that other girl and I said, ooh, she gonna beat your butt. And I started the fight with my words first. And then as soon as the fist started flying, I was like, ooh, look at them go. And so that way I could tell you I didn't have any part in the fight. Repeatedly insisting that they want to change while running at every chance. Change is hard, y'all. We've said it over and over. It is hard and it hurts. And so I really do want to change. I'm not just saying that I want to change. I really do want a different life. But every single step of that feels so heavy that it's easier to take off sometimes, even though when I come back, I have to start all over again. Or controlling the subject. I want to work on this. You know, the relationship I had with my mom, I think is part of why I'm in this position in the first place. And I'd really like to talk about this. Don't ask me any questions about my mom though. Right. So I really want to control it because if I can control the narrative, then I'm controlling what is happening. And that goes back to, why do I want control? Because so much of my life was out of control. Next slide, please. So what can you do? Trust but verify. I used to say this all the time. I ran a safe home for teen girls, and trust but verify. Oh, you went to all your classes today? That is amazing. I am so proud of you. I am still calling the school to double check, right? Because that's the agreement that we have. Connect before you correct. You should not be correcting people you do not have relationship with. That is, it all comes back to that. You first have relationship, connect with that person. It is a human being in front of you. You validate their thoughts and feelings and perceptions that may have led to whatever they said to you. And then you can say, hey, we don't do things like this, and here is why. Extend grace with accountability, right? With accountability. By all means, there's a ton of grace for all of us as we're learning and growing. That doesn't mean that we're not still held accountable to rules and standards of behavior. And while you're trying to teach that, modeling it is actually holding that accountability for someone. Teach them that their actions speak louder than their words and how relationships are impacted. If they cuss people out every day, they might not have friends tomorrow. It is important for you to have friends. You've said to me how much you would like to have a tight friend group, but you yelling the F-bomb at them is chasing people away. So if you really want this friend group you're telling me you want, maybe we can talk about how you're speaking to people that might make them want to stay around you longer. Empower them to strengthen their voice by boosting their credibility. If you lie, if you make up stories, if you fudge, if you omit, people aren't going to believe you. And while that might be okay for now, in the long run, it's really not going to be okay. And what about when you want to have relationships one day? You want those people to trust and believe in you. What about when you want to have a job one day? You want those people to trust and believe in you. And so therefore, this is a skill that's going to help you in the long run if you're able to really think through what you're saying and see if it's true for you. What else can you do? Expect that all students will sometimes lie, omit, or manipulate, at least sometime, because they're human, and we all do, right? We all do this from time to time. Understand that these are survival skills that in non-traumatic environments don't help, okay? They're not character defects. They are survival skills that got that person to be sitting in front of you today. Now they're a skill we no longer need, so we either need to reframe it into a strength or let that skill go by the wayside while we're learning more skills. And then finally, extend forgiveness. It's not personal. There's no need for you to carry it or be upset by it, because it's really about what's going on inside of them, not you at all. Next slide, please. Once trust is hard to build, and it's broken very easily. Once you have broken it, you will not get another chance. That's just, we can't trust you because we are still learning who to trust. And we've already been taught the hard way that there's not very many people out there. So it's really on you to be that safe, trusting person for us. Next slide. So here are some ways that you can build trust for us. Saying you'll do something and not following through. I don't know how to deal with that. If you tell me you're going to do something, you have to do it. If you cannot do it, then you have to come back and say, hey, Marianne, I wasn't able to do XYZ like we had spoken of. I'm so sorry about that. I would like to do this instead, or that's no longer an option, and here's why. And having that conversation, that also teaches me how to do that when I say I'm going to do something and then don't follow through, like show up for an appointment. Not preparing us for sudden change that is coming, right? If you know that something is about to happen, please warn us, please let us know, please give us as much time to get used to the idea. Doesn't mean we can change it, but you give us time to get used to it so that we're prepared for it when it happens. Maybe you even walk us through what it's going to look like so that we have some prepared reactions even for when it happens. doing something you know will cause the students, that could cause them something that could hurt, like calling the abuse hotline. As a counselor, I did this all the time and I had to make several calls. It is always best to tell somebody if you can. It's not always safe, right? So if it's not safe, then please don't. But it is always best to let somebody know if you're going to have to do a hard thing, so that, again, it's that honesty, it's that transparency. Hey, this is something that has to be done. I'm so sorry. I'm going to walk with you through this, right? Or going too long without contact, being inconsistent. We're the ones that are going to run and be inconsistent. I need you to be the one who stays consistent no matter what, who sticks with us, even while we're being wishy-washy. So what do you do instead? Set very clear expectations and boundaries, right? Very clear. Marianne, I expect you to call if you're not going to show up for your meeting on Tuesday. Marianne, if you do not call, you will lose your spot on Tuesday, right? Marianne, I have to call the abuse hotline because of what you told me. Here's the people I have to say it to. Here's how many times I'm going to have to say it. Here are the types of things I'm going to say to them. Is there anything in there that you disagree with? Is there any way we can make this easier for you? Or even, do you want to sit with me while I make the phone call so you can hear what I am saying, so that you are aware that we are saying the same thing here? Never make promises or guarantees. And this is unfortunate, but I hear it a lot. I'm going to get you out of that situation. You're never going to have to go back there again. Boy, I don't control the universe or the law, right? And so I can't say that to somebody. I can't tell them something will never happen or something will happen next. All I can say is, here's what should happen, right? Here's what I hope to happen. But even that can be dangerous, because we don't hear a lot of maybes when we're still caught up in all of the voices in our head. We hear the clear things. And so it's better just to say, here's what I'm going to do, and here's what the law says, or here's what I'm going to do, and here's the hope for you. Set their expectations lower or over deliver, right? Set your expectations low, set my expectations lower, and then over deliver. I hear this said in sales a lot, that they over promise and under deliver, right? We want to be the opposite. I don't want to tell you you're never going to have to go back home to your guardian again because they've been abusive. What I want to tell you is that now that there are eyes on you, that even if you have to go back to that home, people are paying attention now. People are watching now. This will be easier the second time or the next time, because of the fact that there are now people paying attention, even though we didn't get exactly what we wanted now. And then be very patient and intentional in everything you say and do. Don't rush the trust building process. You really can't anyhow. It does take time. And with somebody who's been traumatized through abuse and sexual, emotional, physical, it's going to take even longer. Expect that true trust takes time. Next slide. And then,
we are at the, oh, go ahead, Marianne. Sorry.
no, go ahead, go.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, we'd plan for meditation, but agendas are suggestions oftentimes. So I always try to set that expectation from the beginning, and I did not do that this time. But what I'd like for people to do, one of the things I mentioned this arc earlier, we're not going to dive into it very deeply because I'm going to make sure people get out of here before 3:35. But do want to note, this is all about, arrives at a place of healing centered care. They're all, I mentioned earlier that these are co-occurring processes. It's important to be trauma informed, but what do you do with it once you have that information, right? The way that Marianne just laid that out is showing you how to be trauma responsive, but finally then healing centered. Because if you're not doing your own healing work, it's really difficult. It's the oxygen mask theory. We hear that all the time, right? You can't create a healing space if you're not focusing at the same time on your own healing. And so I just want to encourage all of you. It was a lot of information today. There were a lot of you who showed up, and I'm really, really pleased to see that kind of turnout. And I also want to encourage you to take a moment after this and do something that's healing for you. Do a meditation, do a breathing meditation, go for a walk, some kind of activity. So thank you all so much for today.